Hey guys, hey guys, can you hear me?
Morning.
Good morning.
Hey Jamal,
Yeah,
what you got on the clips order? Surgeon General Fauci Warren.
that's true. Correct. Yeah, yeah, perfect.
2 minutes. Hey Shane. 1 minute. Yep. Okay, and I'm putting your clip all after all Jamarl's clips.
Okay,
All of it.
sounds good. Thank you.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And live from the capital of the ever more divided states of America, it is time now for the show that brings you more side of the issues that matter. In the independent corner, I am investigative theorist and political analyst Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am your indefatigable, ever vigilant, luminous political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Get ready for the show that is the antidotes to propaganda, bringing you truth about the wonders and the dangers of our age. It is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. In the headlines, we've got 8 stories today, loosely clustered. Let's start with this one. Coronavirus infections in the U.S. have resurged. We've seen over 40,000 new infections in the last 24-hour period, and over 1,100 deaths. This is, again, an uptick, one that we're watching out for. Anthony Fauci, has warned that the rate of infection could more than double to 100,000 new cases per day. This comes a day after Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, spoke to members of Congress, saying the path forward was extraordinarily uncertain. In our second story, Vice President Pence will be traveling to Phoenix, Arizona. He is going to be a part of his tour of the nation's new coronavirus hotspots. He said we're in a, quote, much better place, end quote, than we were 4 or even 2 months ago. We have a clip I'll be getting back to a little bit later. In our third story, Chinese scientists have identified and reported a new strain of H1N1 flu currently circulating in pigs in China. They're saying that new strain has pandemic potential. Swine workers have tested positive for antibodies to this new strain, although there are as yet no reported cases of sickness from this new strain in humans. In our fourth headline, in Colorado, former Governor John Hickenlooper has won the Democratic primary to run against the incumbent GOP Senator Cory Gardner. Meanwhile, in Kentucky, Democrat Amy McGrath has narrowly beat Charles Booker in the state's primary, where she will now be running against prominent incumbent GOP Senator and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. In Oklahoma, voters yesterday approved a ballot measure to extend Medicaid to tens of thousands of poor adults. Oklahoma is the first state to expand government-backed health insurance during the pandemic. In our sixth story today, NAFTA's replacement actually is taking effect. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, widely known as the USMCA, will expand and impact trade between the three North American countries. There are, however, a number of unresolved disagreements between the United States and Mexico, including disagreements over the Mexican government's failure to implement new labor laws, how quickly the Mexican government approves pharmaceuticals, as well as an IP law and intellectual property law that the Mexican Congress is considering that would be incompatible with provisions in this new trade deal. Our seventh story, you may not believe it, but Wall Street just saw its strongest quarter in over 20 years. The Dow recorded its best quarter since the first 3 months of 1987 with a 17.8% jump, while the S&P 500 logged its best quarterly gain since the final 3 months of 1998, climbing 19.9%. The NASDAQ Composite lagged very slightly behind with a 30.6% gain, giving it its best performance since the fourth quarter of 1999. After controversial new legislation was passed in Beijing yesterday and implemented in Hong Kong today, Hong Kong police have made their first arrests during demonstrations against the law. The first arrest was of a man holding up a banner advocating for independence for Hong Kong. Anyone convicted of trying to split the territory from the rest of China now faces up to life in prison. Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam says the new legislation will, quote, restore stability, end quote. You know what, in the ninth story here, I'm going to add this one in. In a last-minute op-ed published in the Yadioth Aranoth newspaper, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson urged Israel not to go ahead with its formal annexation of portions of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley, which Netanyahu has said could start as soon as today. Johnson said he is, quote, immensely proud, end quote, of the UK's support of the founding of Israel with the Balfour Declaration, but that it, quote, will remain unfinished business until there is a solution which provides justice and lasting peace for both Israelis and Palestinians, end quote. You know what? You're all caught up. That's the news. Those are the headlines. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to throw this in before I pass it over to you, Jamarl. It's technically not a headline, but we're now halfway through the year. We're entering the second act of 2020. I'd say that's right on time for the alien invasions, asteroids, and the accidental opening of a gateway to a previously unknown but utterly terrifying alternate dimension. So, Jamarl, what's your top priority for the show today?
Oh, you can't pass that to me like that and not not expect me to get into that. But I'll put that to the side for the moment. Look, I rarely do this, but if you've watched the show, you know I will die on the flag if it's something that I believe is right. By the same token, I do have the capacity to change my mind or moderate my opinion if I think I may be wrong or if I think my position needs to be more nuanced. And we're at a position where I think my position needs to be nuanced. After my experience at 7-Eleven last night, I realized that my position on Fauci needed adjustment. This is not because the audience was against me. This is not because my co-host was against me. This is directly related to my experience last night at 7-Eleven that was absolutely aggravating. And even shocking to my conscience to some degree that I would even have to have the conversation. So, the Surgeon General of the United States, Jerome Adams, if you remember in the beginning, was telling people that mask wasn't necessarily important in protecting people from the infection. Let's hear the clip.
The American people, we can based on what we know. What the World Health Organization and the CDC have reaffirmed in the last few days is that they do not recommend the general public wear masks. Here's why. On an individual level, there was a study in 2015 looking at medical students, and medical students wearing surgical masks touch their face on average 23 times. We know a major way that you can get respiratory diseases like coronavirus is by touching a surface and then touching your face. So wearing a mask improperly can actually increase your risk of getting disease. It can also give you a false sense of security, and you see many of these pictures with people out and about closer than 6 feet to each other, but still wearing a mask. On a population level, it's important for people to know that we tell sick people to wear masks so that you don't transmit disease to others. But again, if that encourages people to get together too close, then you may mitigate the effect or cancel out the effect of people wearing masks. And then finally, there's consequences. And we still have PPE shortages across the country. The WHO mentioned this in their statement. So we want to make sure we are reserving PPE for the people who most need it. That's how you're going to get the largest effect. Because if healthcare workers get sick, they can't take care of you when you get sick.
Right there. Now, that's important. You have to take the entire statement. We also have the most trusted man in America, Dr. Fauci. Let's hear Fauci's clip early on.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And often there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
And can you get some schmutz sort of staying inside there?
Of course. But when you think masks, you should think of healthcare providers needing them and people who are ill. The people who, when you look at the films of foreign countries and you see 85% of the people wearing masks, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not against it. If you want to do it, that's fine.
But it can lead to a shortage of masks.
Exactly. That's the point. It could lead to a shortage of masks for the people who really need it.
Notice you say at the end that could lead to a shortage of masks. That's where the emphasis is. It should go to the healthcare workers. Now, the reality of it is, if indeed it should go to the healthcare workers, then by definition the masks work, because you wouldn't necessarily have healthcare workers using masks that didn't work. Nevertheless, you understand his point that he was getting at. Now, I've argued that that is a political statement, not necessarily a lie. But in the same way that Fauci said there could be consequences to wearing a mask, there could be consequences to you putting out a statement like that. Severe, deep consequences that go beyond the truth of it and even go beyond the statement or the reaction or the effects of that particular statement in regards to the wider populace, especially to people who don't want to wear those masks and is looking for any reason, any fig leaf, anything that they can raise up regardless of the accuracy of what they're raising up. The very fact that a statement like that was made is something that imbue them with a sense of, yes, I have this fig leaf that I can now use to go after real science and real evidence and put people's lives at risk in the process. Now, for the moment, be honest. Whether you realize it or not, or even accept it, is infinitely true. Ideology is a poor substitute for reality. The question that Fauci had to deal with was he really willing to invest confidence in a purely ideological choice of ethics in order to not do an ethical choice of allowing tens of thousands of people to potentially be ill or die? Now, be fearlessly honest and engage my point for the moment. Thousands of lives of healthcare workers and tens of thousands of sick and vulnerable people have an extravagant medical need for those masks that must take priority over the casual wearers with little to no risk of infections if they're social distancing and otherwise healthy. Now, this is the choice that to some degree he's confronted with. Also, the Pollyannish attitude that believes in radical honesty has the hope and pray after a statement of radical honesty is made in this rigidly individualistic society that those stores, online or otherwise, that people won't rush those stores for masks in order to protect themselves and their loved ones. The incentive structure in this individualistic society somewhat writes itself is overt and obvious. We are the home of the rugged individualist, a fancy phrase for the prevailing philosophy of radical selfishness. Systems of mainstream thought and media tend to embrace and organize its workable point of view around the interests of the ruling class. I got mine, screw you. Check out the European countries and explain to me how what I said was wrong. We accept nearly half of the population living in relentless, wretched poverty. Our media doesn't even consider it to be a national emergency. The anonymous violence of an impersonal system that obfuscates the real cause of economic trauma as a failure of self versus a failure of the society that simultaneously allowed private sector to rape the public blind while exploding costs for people. To rape the public blind with exploding costs for human beings to just exist instead of fulfilling the tenets of the Constitution to ensure a tenuous situation doesn't turn catastrophic. Just because you believe that the choice is ethical doesn't mean you can flagrantly ignore the predictable consequences of the action. Just as a point of fact, the ethical choice does not take into consideration or must take into consideration real world outcomes. It is ludicrous to believe that I was right to dispense radical honesty, but 10,000 people died as a result of my ideological precise choice. Again, your ideology is not real. Now, all of that, being that it is true, needs to be moderated. And it's not exactly true in the way that it's operated in real world terms. It is not beyond the pale to say that the information has evolved in regards to what Fauci and CDC were using. It is also not wrong to say that Fauci took a political stance, the CDC took a political stance that allowed them to basically save the mass population that they needed, especially for people who were ill and medical workers. However, put a schism in our consciousness, in our society, that allowed a certain percentage of that society to run around and saying, these guys are lying, the masks don't work. Fauci is singing a different tune now, and it was singing a different tune since April, actually since the CDC and the World Health Organization changed their minds. But let's hear Fauci now. What do you think about the mask now, Fauci? Play the clip.
Dr. Fauci, back in March, you also said, quote, looking at what we're seeing now, you expected there to be between 100,000 and 200,000 coronavirus deaths and millions of infections in the U.S. So let's flash forward to late June. Here we are at the end of June. We've already seen 126,000 deaths with infection rates rising rapidly. Dr. Fauci, based on what you're seeing now, how many COVID-19 deaths and infections should America expect before this is all over?
I can't make an accurate prediction, but it is going to be very disturbing. I will guarantee you that, because when you have an outbreak in one part of the country, even though in other parts of the country they're doing well, they are vulnerable. I made that point very clearly last week at a press conference. We can't just focus on those areas that are having the surge. It puts the entire country at risk. We are now having 40,000+ new cases a day. I would not be surprised if we go up to 100,000 a day if this does not turn around. And so I am very concerned.
All right, so let's take a break here, and we're going to come back to fault lines. And I want to discuss my experience with you that I had yesterday, Lee, that has brought, Shane, that has brought me to this new perspective of things. Welcome to Fault Lines. We'll be back in a moment. Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my host, Shane Stranahan. We've just went through some headlines, and I just want to finish the story real quick. So I go into 7-Eleven, and the gentleman is standing there with a mask around his neck. And I'm looking at him, and I decide to stay back, like 10 feet, because I look at what he's doing as a political statement. He's talking to the guy who's in the aisle or who's working at the store. That guy has to deal with customers day in and day out and put his life at risk. And this guy is making overt political statement, having a mask around his neck. Now, the cashier calls me up. I stay back. I say, I'll wait for that guy to pass. Now, that guy looks at me and says, well, why? I said, you're wearing your mask around. You're not wearing your mask. He says, no, I'm wearing my mask. I said, well, you have it around your throat. That's not necessarily doing anything. And so he says, well, the mask doesn't work anyway. I said, no, the mask actually does work, which is why I'm wearing mine and you see everybody else wearing theirs. And then he says, well, I mean, it depends on what information source you get. I said, yes, it does. And some information sources are more credible than others. Now, this guy, who clearly is a Trump supporter, and I heard him say the president said X or the president said Y, he looks around and walks around the store still with his mask around his neck, not necessarily wanting to put the mask on. And the fact that he said information sources, what he's talking about is Fauci and the Surgeon General and the statements that these guys were making in the beginning that they have now clung to like grim death in order to assert a political disposition that has nothing to do with science and is using scientists to do it. That's why my position moderated. When I heard that guy say that, I was like, oh, Fauci. Fauci. Damn it, Fauci. Because that guy was basically emboldened in his political stance based on the thing that the scientists were saying in the beginning. So Shane, to some degree, I still say that I can't necessarily blame Fauci for his actions, but maybe there was a better way to do it where he could have, at the very least, not denigrated the mask while simultaneously getting across that the public needs these things and somehow protecting them. I agree with you, Shane. I need to moderate my position on this. Fauci might have been wrong.
That's brave of you, man. I'm going to give you a private round of applause. I'm not even saying I'm right, anything like that. It's because it's not about you coming over to my side. It's just you said you're reconsidering a position publicly on the air. That's a dangerous thing to do. So good on you for that. Straight up. I mean, my response, it's, I was listening to that whole thing. I was thinking about it, and I wasn't sure where you were going, so I wasn't sure what attitude I was supposed to take. Are we getting into a little scuffle here? What's it going to be? But I mean, my takeaway is this. I was thinking about this issue too over the night. The problem is, if you look at it, these various political figures, and like you correctly stated, that's what they are. They're taking these positions for political reasons because they operate in this political system. These various political players could have done quite a few things in advance. And effectively what they did was they had to tell these white lies because they didn't do those things. So something as simple as getting a stockpile of masks, getting a national emergency stockpile of masks going years ago. I mean, SARS was a thing, I believe it was 2002. MERS was within the last decade. People have been worrying about specifically a novel coronavirus. Specifically, we're calling it the novel coronavirus, but a new coronavirus coming around. This stuff is foreseeable, and that's what's so damn frustrating to me about this, is we had literally years, decades to prepare for this. This stuff isn't that expensive. I can't, the mask that you're buying, even the surgeon masks, which, while not ideal, would probably be better than nothing from what everybody's saying. We could have had that stuff stockpiled in the millions or the tens of millions. That stuff doesn't seem that expensive. It seems like a drop in the larger federal bucket. But it's these kinds of contingent scenarios that you need to prepare for if you're a leader. It's these kinds of black swan events that you need to be, if you have a competent team, if you have a competent staff, you're going to be watching out for these things because these are the real long-term detriments. And we didn't do that. And then they had to tell these white lies. And that's where it gets egregious. Another perspective on this, if you look at it from a sort of first principles basis, what happens in a political context when somebody tells a lie? Well, if it's in a political context, then there are going to be people who are on their side before they tell the lie and people who are against them before they tell the lie. And after they tell the lie, you're introducing a schism into reality, literally into a definition of reality that then gets politicized and played up. So some people see the truth, but can't really take action on it because they're having to deal with other people who can't see the truth because they've bought into this story. And I think, again, we talk about these larger problems of distrust. Right now we're talking about problems of distrust in the sciences, but it applies to politics too. Once you start peddling lies, once you start needing to peddle lies to keep the system that you're operating functioning, you introduce this whole host of problems. And these are inevitable first principles problems that you can look at. It's not too complicated. And we're getting deeper and deeper and deeper into them. So the politicization of this stuff is important, but in a real deep sense, you could talk about ethics, you could talk about politics, you could take this in a number of different directions. But regardless, that is a huge failure. So good on you for coming around. We can keep talking about it. And of course, we'll have the opportunity to potentially, because we have Mikhail Kogan coming on in this next segment.
Yeah.
But I will throw it out. We haven't thrown this out yet. We've got about 5 minutes or so where we can take calls. If anybody wants to call in, 202-521-1320 is the number.
So I kind of agree with you, but I still don't think I was wrong in the absolute. Like, I think I'm moderating the position. I still don't necessarily think Fauci was entirely wrong in what he did. Now, but I think he had to do it in a different way because this came out really screwed up for like 20% of the population. For example, Washington Post, more than 4 in 10 saw shortages of protective surgical masks and 36% in their supply of hand sanitizer running low, according to the Post. This is healthcare providers. You have a dire shortage of personal protective equipment for healthcare workers emerged in March as the earliest signs of the country heard preparations for the coronavirus. Nurses and others said they were forced to put their own health at risk for caring for highly infectious patients and didn't have adequate supplies for masks that filter out 90% of the stuff. Now, the reason why I'm bringing that up is because all of this is taking place in the context of that. And to be fair, Fauci had no power over whether the federal government loaded up on those products. He had no power over pushing the Production Act, the Work Production Act that basically could enforce companies to produce these things. So Fauci is powerless in that aspect. And because he's powerless in it, he's stuck with the notion of, okay, what can I do within my power to allow this to take place? And what they could do in their power in regards to the scientific community was go out there and say, okay, the masks are not perfectly effective. Well, no, clearly it's not perfectly effective. And to go out and make that statement in order to try to protect the supply. His issue was weakness brought about by an ineffectual government. That's why I don't entirely hit him on this. Because ultimately, what was he going to do? He tried to get the president of the United States to get more stuff. The president didn't want to get more stuff. The president didn't even want to push private companies to make the supplies. And so you have a shortage with the federal government not doing anything but a shortage. That's why I'm not entirely down on him on this, because to my mind, what ends up happening is the public goes out and buys the mask anyway, if you're being honest with them, because they want to protect their families. And in buying the mask anyway, you have a shortage. And that shortage for healthcare workers and for human beings that actually really need those masks. That's why I don't hit him entirely on this. But I do look at it and say, oh man, that guy from 7-Eleven is multiplied thousands of times over. And he is going out and making an argument to people that the masks don't work. And to some degree is using Fauci's face to make that argument. Oh, that's aggravating. And that means that something was wrong.
Yeah, and I think people do single out Fauci again. He was the sort of guy in the administration who would subtly push back on Trump sometimes, and so even his identity, his persona, or whatever, that became politicized. Yeah. And so I don't think it's appropriate to just focus on him. Again, the first clip you played was Jerome Powell, U.S. Surgeon General. He said the most egregious stuff, and I don't really hear people criticizing him. The World Health Organization and the CDC, like you were saying, Fauci was pretty much just saying what they were saying to say about this stuff. There's this multi-layered problem. And so that's why I'm trying to look at it from first principles, because trying to look at it because otherwise you do get lost in this rhetorical thing where you're talking about one person, whereas in reality, the problem is systemic.
Yeah, it was systemic. CDC, all these guys were back in this position.
That's the thing. Yeah, and again, as far as I can tell, for the same exact reasons, because there was this shortage of masks and all that stuff was foreseeable. There's this conversation about what actually went wrong there. And it seems probably too close to tell. I've heard a lot of people talking about this. One really quick position is a lack of funding. But as far as I can tell, there actually is quite a bit of funding getting thrown around, and masks aren't that expensive. So for me, that doesn't fly too far. I really want to get into it at some point. But again, we're still so fresh in it. And I'm just worried that any investigations are going to be so politicized right now that it would be more smoke than fire.
No, I feel you. But the mask thing was real. I mean, like I said, by the time they were in March, they were in an emergency in regards to the mask thing. That's not me making it up. That's a flat fact. That's just kind of true. And
it's true.
Go for it.
No, it's true. No, it's just, you're totally, it is true. That's the thing. But again, we should have prepared for this.
Oh, I agree with you. I guess my basic argument is that Fauci had no power to do anything in this process. He had to entirely rely on a federal government that wasn't willing to do anything. Like, that's what I mean when I say it's a multi-layered problem. It's kind of like cops, right? It's like the public doesn't do what the public needs to do in order to ensure the communities are whole. And so they decide, let's just throw in cops. And cops can never really manage that situation in any kind of real, legitimate way. And so you end up with these kind of erroneous situations that shouldn't happen one way or the other.
I don't buy that. I mean, I think it's okay to ask our leaders to be heroes. And I think the heroic thing for Fauci to do here, I understand you're saying there's this ethical dilemma. And we could get into that because, again, this whole thing about white lies, there's this other side of this that I kind of brought up earlier. But the point is, while he may not have had the authority to order these preparations, he could have, by prominently criticizing the administration's approach fairly early on, by talking about how we weren't prepared, how we needed to get these stockpiles going, by making a ruckus, basically.
Yes.
Again, he's operating within a bureaucracy, and I get there are both incentives and, literally, he doesn't have certain abilities. But what he does have is a voice and a platform. And I think that he used that in a little bit too subtle, in this weird, subtle, subversive way that didn't actually get the truth across. He mimicked these lies, which everybody knew were lies. Again, white lies, arguably, but still lies. He was downplaying the importance of masks. Yeah. And in my opinion, that stuff is unacceptable. I want our leaders to that's what you need. If you have, the nature of the problem is that we have these overdeveloped and stagnant political systems that are stuck in this state of political gridlock. And to break out of that, you need action. Now, people go to the vote, and arguably it has a limited effect because the system, constrains who they can vote for, constrains the space of candidates, the Overton window, all that stuff. On the other side, though, you have all these people within the political system. And I think that really a way to do this is you start holding those people to task. Now, how do you do that? I don't know. But I think that's one really good tack to take. What's your take on that?
I think you're right on this. I mean, but I think you're right. But I don't think you're entirely reconciling the potential chaos on the other end of that. That's the only thing. It's like, I do think you're right that an option would have been to challenge the system. This is unacceptable. This is horrible. So I do think I give that credence. Definitely. I agree with you on that.
You know what? Let's go into a break. We've got Dr. Mikhail Kogan coming on right up next. We can get more into this conversation. If he's on the line, he's been listening in, so maybe we can carry this forward. But regardless, we're going to be talking with him about COVID-19 and about how nursing homes have been hit. So that should be a sad but useful conversation to have. We need to talk more about those issues. Regardless, though, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Yo, Tashawn, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars. Again, Sean? Experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we are back again. You're listening right now to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Before we get to our guest, very much looking forward to this conversation. Here's how you can listen to us. If you're in the DC area, you can catch us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If you're in Kansas City, you can also listen to us at 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM. You can also catch us online, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, YouTube, Spotify, Periscope. We're everywhere, honestly. Regardless, though, that's enough about us. Let's get into the conversation now. We are joined now by Dr. Mikhail Kogan. He is the medical director of the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, assistant professor of medicine at George Washington University, and the founder and executive director of the AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. Dr. Kogan, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Thank you. I have a little update. I'm an associate professor now. I've been promoted 2 weeks ago, so a little positive change in my life there.
Good to hear. Good for her. Tell her we said congrats. So we brought you on. I don't know how much of the last conversation you caught. We were just talking about Fauci, and more broadly than Fauci. Yeah, this conversation about the masks and preparation for the masks. So we were just saying a bunch of stuff. We've been having this conversation over the last couple of days. But what's your take on that whole thing?
Well, I've also been in Facebook mostly discussion on several pages, including our own little town at Tacoma Park here. I think there's a lot of confusion. There's an extremely polarized issue. There seems to be people who feel like the masks are a complete political hoax, and then there are people who, if you walk into a place and you don't have a mask, they will walk away. I think the reality, there's two things that I want to contribute. And remember, you don't ask me political questions, right? So I will just answer the things that I think medically relevant. So first of all, if you know that your distancing is appropriate, and I would say, 6 feet is official, I'd say please 10 feet or more. My take on masks is that they're optional. In fact, they're probably not even needed if you're absolutely sure that you're not going to come into contact with anyone, number one. Number two, that contact, when the masks are probably not needed, needs to be relatively short. Why am I saying this? Well, I see a lot of people running, biking, having masks on. And, if you're an elite athlete and you've trained yourself up to a degree of doing that, that's probably okay. But if you're a person who's picking up the exercise, or you're trying to change your program and suddenly you're planning on a run and you're putting a mask on, and I don't know. I actually tried that, and I'll tell you, I nearly passed out. So I feel quite strongly that when we're outdoors, when we're in pretty isolated areas, when we're exercising, meaning that even if we do come in close contact with someone, we're in a fleeting contact for a second, it's probably unnecessary. The rest, when we're in a crowded spaces, when we are in areas where there's a good chance that we're going to be in contact with someone for a significant amount of time, I think the masks make a lot of sense. Whether or not which masks, I think that's a very important and separate discussion. I've been tracking down lately developments in mask industry. So I don't know if you guys discussed this. So there's this copper mesh masks. There's this new technologies that include masks that have some static electric that are proposed to kill viruses. I don't know if that'll pan out in terms of the science, but I think if it does, we may end up seeing certain masks that are going to be more reusable, more comfortable, fitting better, etc. But I think for now, surgical masks are our best bet. They're quickly available. There are actually several types. Of the ones that loop around the ear, I'm not exactly sure they're the best. I personally prefer the ones that you can tie in the back or a rubber band going to a bag. They tend to create a little better seal. And then, of course, if you're a very high risk exposure, which I think we're discussing today, right, about the nursing home, for example, then the N95. The N95, they have issues because you have to be properly fitted for one. If you're not, they're not as effective. So the whole topic is way more complicated, but I think I've spoken up about this topic. So let's
I'm curious. I'm glad that you're talking about it. From your perspective, if you were in the position of either Jerome Powell or Fauci or the CDC and the World Health Organization, you accept and you agree that there was a shortage in the mask. And what do you think about the opinion that these guys gave? And would you have made that opinion given the circumstances to which you were faced with, meaning a government that wasn't necessarily doing the job and a shortage that was real and legit? How would you have dealt with this, and what would you have said to the public?
Well, again, politically speaking, I don't want to discuss the fact that, and my personal belief is that they totally missed the opportunity of stacking up on masks. And in fact, they had multiple experts proposing to them saying we need to have a national stockpile, and it didn't happen. I don't know who's politically responsible or sort of what's A or B here. I don't know. It's a missed opportunity. There's no question about it. And somebody should take a responsibility and say, look, we screwed up, and this is what we're going to do to sort of fix this. From sort of our clinical experience right now, when the pandemic had started in the first few weeks at our hospital, Drew W. University, we had to rush in the mask and we had to be very careful. Now things are a lot better. Everybody, the whole hospital wearing the masks. Most of the people, I would say, wear standard surgical masks with pretty high proportion wearing N95s, but we don't have shortage of either. So, the masks are not rocket science, right? Making the standard surgical and N95 mask in scaling up the operation should not have been something complicated. So, and I think that's all I want to say. It does sound, at least for first responders, for healthcare providers, the shortages have hopefully more or less have gone away, in at least in our area. That's what I'm seeing. But I think somebody got to take responsibility for it going forward.
I'm curious, where did we go wrong? Because at one point it seemed like the United States had some level of control over it, despite the fact that our cases was going through the roof. But something had to go wrong somewhere. Someone had to mistake a policy for this to come ravaging back in the way that it's come ravaging back. And what are we expecting in, let's say, August or September?
Yeah. I think that's the most important question. You can look at this politically, but you can also look at this culturally and sort of how do we respond individually to this. I actually feel that it's not all politics here. I think what I'm seeing a lot in the culture, and I think you guys just talked about it. I'm sorry I tuned in maybe 20 minutes ago and was listening off here because my kids were running out of the door to a camp. But, somebody was walking into, one of you was saying how you walked in and you saw this guy wearing the mask on the mouth and the nose not covered or not covered at all. I don't remember. But, we got to take responsibility. It's not all about politicians doing things. The masks in enclosed spaces is common sense. Why are we not all simply following it? And I think that's exactly what happened. The Memorial Day sort of semi-opening of certain states, and people just relaxed. And, I think we all felt this fatigue, right? You have all these new things you got to do, and eventually part of us begin to kind of rebel against it and saying, screw it, Well, it's not the time. In fact, the time right now is the most important time. There was a hope that we're going to sort of wane down and then have a second spike in the fall. Well, it doesn't look like it, right? It looks like we just keep going up. And, whether this is a second spike or third, but the reality is it's a personal responsibility. No matter what the laws have said where, you have to make your own decision. You have to understand the science. You have to use it appropriately. You need to feel comfortable too. If you're feeling like whatever science tells you is completely wrong, well, maybe you need to educate yourself a little bit better. And if you're still coming to a conclusion that this is all BS, well, then God help us. Because in reality, politicians should be saying whatever they should be saying. That's their job. But public should not only listen to politicians. Public should be listening to science as well.
Dr. Kogan, thank you so much for that. I actually have a few more questions about the masks. I've been seeing a number of what I would consider misconceptions about them, including people who are saying, and it does seem like they do lower the concentration of oxygen because you have a lot of carbon dioxide in between your mouth and the mask, but it doesn't seem like unless you were doing intense exertion like you're talking about, like you're going to see serious effects from that. But I might be getting this wrong. Can you please explain the situation with
Yeah.
oxygen? Yeah.
Absolutely correct. In order for you to not do well with a mask, the exertion is supposed to be quite high. Most people walking should be just fine. At least if you walk relatively slow. I'm talking about probably sort of the capacity is close to 75-80% of your maximum, where your oxygen demand is so high that masks can obstruct it. I'm also not talking about N95, although I've followed that as well. Even N95 masks, supposedly, if your activity is relatively low intensity, you should be fine with. That's really important to understand. So we're mostly discussing this issue in intensive exercise, which hopefully most of us, all of us, are getting. And that's why I wanted to discuss a little bit about if you prefer outdoor exercise, and myself included. I feel that's one place where, masks are probably not needed. And this is where I go a little bit against, I don't know if you guys seen this, but Maryland has now basically made a universal mandate. They did say that in the cases where social distancing is not possible, but they didn't specify that. So I just give an example. When you're on a running trail and you come close with someone for a second, I don't consider that a significant exposure. Most likely that person is healthy. Most likely that person is with you in your field just for a few seconds and then passing. The risk to pick up something there for either of you is extremely low.
Fault lines. Breaking news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories, all in one place. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
We are back with Dr. Mikhail Kogan. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. So, Dr. Kogan, before we left, I kind of brought this question up. It's somewhat of a deep question, I suppose. But from your medical field, from your medical perspective of the world, as you're looking out, I would imagine that you had to reconcile yourself with this notion of America and science. Beyond the point of what Americans should do, why do you think they tend to position themselves in such odd, precarious ways regarding scientific research?
Well, I think there are more than one answer. I think it's a very complicated topic. I think one issue for sure is that there's a really strong political division and kind of this very polarized, and people tend to like to accept the opinions of people they trust. And so if the politics are polarized, I think a lot of what happens down from there is polarization of entire society. And I think it does spill out to science as well, because, of course, if we'd have a pure science and we'd make our own judgments and everything. But unfortunately, I think in this day and age of social information floating everywhere, all the networks and we basically get most of the scientific data somehow watered down to us. So we're not really reading the articles ourselves. I'm going to ask you, when is the last time you actually read the study describing something about the masks as an actual study, not as somebody else's interpretation of that study?
3 days ago.
Probably not. Oh, well, you're special. But in reality, most people don't do that. I mean, most people will read somebody else's opinion and then try to somehow either read the abstract of the study or try to formulate that opinion. But unfortunately, that's not that easy to do, because most of us don't have that specific scientific background to understand it appropriately. And then I think that's where it all starts, because then there's people who would split that data in whichever way they want. And so it's not like suddenly something that an evidence that was supposed to be clear is no longer clear because one expert says one thing and another person says another thing. That kind of brings me to a really important point. I think, in generally speaking, we're seeing a dramatic watered down of evidence-based medicine, which is very heartbreaking for me. I was trained by Dr. Jared Paccione in Montefiore, New York, who I, until now, still consider sort of a Dr. House of evidence. He always taught us, how do you read your own evidence and how do you really sort of bypass expert quote-unquote opinions and get to the data and understand it. And unfortunately, we're seeing less and less of that capacity in the society and even in a medical profession and general healthcare professionals to be able to critically understand this. On top of that, there's also a lot of influence from the industry itself. I mean, the industry wants us to see what it wants us to see, and I'm not just talking about medical industrial complex, I'm taking it more generally. Wherever you have a possibility of financial gains, you have to immediately take that into account and interpret the data accordingly. And that makes it even more complicated. So sorry I'm giving a long answer like this, but in reality, I feel like part of it is really the fact that we are overloaded with information and confusing information, number one. Number two, we don't have a basic background in correctly interpreting the data.
And I'm sad to say, so this is the guy who said 3 days. I just looked back. It was actually 2. And I've got to say, it wasn't a very good paper. And this sort of ties in. This is another side of the thing that you didn't bring up this as far as I can remember, but you alluded to the problem generally, where the paper that I read was published by a sort of dissident professor in an unrelated discipline who was critical of masks. And what he did was he looked at older studies of influenza transmission, the droplet sizes of influenza transmission. And right off the bat, I could see not only was he taking examples that weren't inherently applicable because they were about influenza, but then he was misconstruing them. He was taking, for instance, there was a study that was done in, I believe, 2016 that he referenced in his paper. This is a guy, a professor of physics, not even biology, let alone virology. But he was referencing a paper from 2016 that said that there was a very low variation between surgical masks and N95 masks in preventing influenza transmission. Now, the way that he put it, the way that he sort of summarized the abstract from that other paper was, well, neither of them are effective. But if you actually click through and read the paper, it's saying each of these are quite effective. It's just they're similarly effective for the droplet size. So as a sort of general problem, not only do I see people in the public misrepresenting things or choosing to ignore things or only reading, the first couple of words are skin deep, so to speak. But I also see people publishing outside of their disciplines and getting a lot of attention, even when what they're publishing is fairly easily disprovable. And again, I'm not a scientist. I don't have any background in this stuff. I've read a couple of scientific papers in my life, but not that many, honestly. And as far as I can tell, it just takes that cursory inspection.
That's exactly the point I was also making, is that that's not an actual study that you were reading. You were reading an expert opinion interpreting a bunch of studies. So, and that's the problem, especially if the read like this cannot be correctly filtered. What was going on 10, 20 years ago? Well, for the evidence like this, for this person who wrote this, to end up being processed by a significant proportion of public, there would have been some kind of a process, right? I mean, there's some kind of a consensus meeting or something, and then eventually it would have been published in a bigger journal, etc. Right now, this person will put it on their social media account, and if that person somehow accumulated 1,000 followers, next thing you know, there's an explosion of this everywhere. And so it's not filtered appropriately, it's not screened appropriately, but now it's the big news and everywhere. So that's part of the issue, is that, again, the data runs out there without being appropriately screened, and that also creates the havoc. In reality, look, we even know, remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about me saying, look at the Lancet data on that hydroxychloroquine was deadly and not effective. It's Lancet. It's the number 1 or 2 or whatever journal in the world. And then they retracted the paper because they didn't screen it appropriately. But before that even happened, that study was everywhere. Our head of infectious disease at the hospital was discussing this paper at a grand rounds at university. So we live in a time when the speed of information processing and exchange is so high that even a minute mistake runs amok and causes all kinds of ripples. And I think that's an old part of this kind of a social wavering and this polarization. And some people are just attaching themselves to one camp and some people to another. And unfortunately, getting the right in the midst of this for a person who is, who wants to stay right is not easy, because they reading, some of their friends may be going left, some may be going right. Some of their experts they trust going left, going right. So how do you make this right decisions in there? And I don't have good answers. I mean, I tell you what in reality should have been done. There should be some kind of very trusted authorities that we all can follow. But as it turns out, that's not so easy as we may think. So
that was a great answer. Yeah, and thank you for the correction. That was a paper that I read, not a study, although it did link to some studies. But no, Jamarl, go ahead.
No, I love that distinction. And I think you make a really good point. So how do we, if you had the option of talking to somebody, I guess in power or control or something to that effect, what is the new research on the COVID-19 virus that may, I guess, help us kind of lower this trend line one more time to try to bring it down into control? What's the new research going along with the virus itself? Or treatment of the virus, I should say. Or for that matter, even the virus itself.
Are you asking for the sources of information, or you're asking sort of what's the updates on the research?
Just an update on the research. Have they come away with any new, I guess, findings or understanding of the way COVID-19, I guess, functions?
Yeah, I think, this is one of those things where information changes every second. And, I personally, here's what I do. I stopped following every single study because I realized this is really not possible. I mean, there's several resources that are publishing papers even before they peer-reviewed, just to get things out very quickly. So then they're overwhelming, thousands and thousands of papers being put on a regular basis. So I do a couple of things. So one, I simply follow a CDC, and I kind of try to gauge what changes have happened. Second, we have an updates weekly in our own university, which I try to come to make sure I don't miss anything sort of that's consensus of a medical body. I think that there's sort of the big things that are clear is that we're sort of hopefully beginning to see some treatments being effective. So the steroid, the dexamethasone, the paper was published in UK. That seems to be now universally accepted that it had a pretty significant decrease in the length of stay and mortality in pretty sick patients. So we're beginning to see some bright news. There possibility of China actually that it's already created an effective vaccine. They're now starting to give it to their military. Now, is that going to pan out? I don't know. So, but those seems like even if one of those is incorrect, there seems to be several things that are coming up. There are multiple drugs on the market that are being in different stages of research, different venues, different directions. Like there's a Canadian drug that's looking at the boosting of a glutathione production. Glutathione is an endogenous molecule that detoxifies, and it's really critical in controlling or wiping out effects of inflammation. And as you know, that one of the big problems with the infection when it occurs here is when you have an inflammatory response going amok, it creates a lot of junk. So if you can't clear that junk, people do a lot worse. So there's a drug that was possibly going to be successful, but even if it's not, you can think about this. Well, glutathione is publicly available. So something you can take under the tongue. Topically, there are a variety of different ways to take it. So as more and more research like this accumulates, I think for me personally, what I'm following, what I see exciting is we're finally entering the point where it sounds like we're going to see some really good pearls coming up soon in terms of the treatment and prevention. In terms of pathophysiology, unfortunately, I can't follow everything. So I don't know if there's anything substantially new. To me, I think one of the critical aspects to find out here is this virus mutating, and what is the rate of that mutation in terms of when we're doing all this tests, and there are many, many tests now everywhere, how accurate are those tests if the virus keeps mutating? I mean, for example, you guys probably already discussed the fact that if the person who had been asymptomatic tested positive with antibody, it turns out that just a couple of weeks or a month later, that test is going to be negative. So that antibody that was generated is likely going to get lost. And is that person then in a month or two no longer protected? We don't know, but it's seemingly possible that is the case. So some of
Dr.
the things
Kogan,
are very
we have,
uncertain.
About 30 seconds left, just before we leave, before we have to take a break. But I am curious. I saw research going into the image of the molecule or the image of the COVID-19 virus, and it looked like it was creating these strands that was coming out of the cell. I thought viruses basically create a mutation inside the cell itself, getting it to reproduce its own, let's say, viral mechanisms in order to propagate the virus. But this looked like it was doing something slightly different. Am I misunderstanding what I was saying here, or is this kind of accurate? And could you explain that? We only have about a minute left.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how to explain this in terms of the molecular, but virus can do all kinds of things to the cell. Meaning, virus can control certain cellular functions and then change function of the cell to do certain things that the cell was not doing before. So you're correct in that. It's not always just killed it. It can do all kinds of other things, secrete certain hormones, etc. So that's probably what you're asking.
Dr. Michael Kogan, we've been speaking with Dr. Michael Kogan, Assistant Professor of Medicine at George Washington University, founder and Executive Director of the AIM Health Institute, a Washington-based nonprofit of integrative services to the underserved. Thank you for coming to the show, Doctor. You are listening to Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the capital of the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation of propaganda. In the left corner, I am your indefatigable, ever vigilant, luminous political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your luminiferous aether. That just came out of my mind. That's a very obscure joke. I am your investigative theorist and political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
Let's get to the headlines. In the news, Fauci warned of the rate of infection could more than double to 100,000 new cases a day if we don't adequately contain the novel coronavirus. The following comments from Fed Chair Jerome Powell to members of Congress, in which he said the path forward was extraordinarily uncertain. Vice President Pence will travel to Phoenix, Arizona, as part of his tour of the nation's new coronavirus hotspots. He said, "We're in a much better place than we were 4 or even 2 months ago." I don't know if he even checked outside his window. Chinese scientists have identified and reported a new strain of H1N1 flu currently circulating in pigs in China with pandemic potential. Swine workers have tested positive for antibodies in the new strain, although there has of yet been no reports of sickness in animals and humans. The Colorado former Governor John Hickenlooper has won the Democratic primary to run against incumbent GOP Senator Cory Gardner. In Kentucky, Democrat Amy McGrath has narrowly defeated Charles Booker in the state primary, where she will now be running against prominent incumbent GOP Senator, Turtle Man himself, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Oklahoma voters on Tuesday approved a ballot measure to extend Medicaid to tens of thousands of poor adults. There are first states to expand government-backed health care insurance during the pandemic. Good for them. Today's NAFTA replacement takes effect. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, widely known as USMCA, will expand and impact trade between 3 North American countries. There are, however, a number of unresolved disagreements between the United States and Mexico, including disagreements over the Mexican government's failure to implement new labor laws. How quickly the Mexican government approves pharmaceutical as well as intellectual property law for the Mexican Congress is considering that would be incompatible with provisions of the USMCA. You may not believe it, but Wall Street just saw the strongest quarter in nearly 20 years. The Dow recorded its best quarter since the first 3 months of 1987 with a 17.8% jump, while the S&P logged its quarterly gain since the final 3 months of 1999, climbing 19.9%. The Nasdaq Compact lagged very slightly behind with a 30.6% gain, giving it the best performance since the first quarter of 1999. Who knew you had 40 million people out of a job? After controversial new legislation was passed in Beijing yesterday and implemented in Hong Kong today, Hong Kong police have made their first arrest during demonstrations against the law. The first arrest was a man holding up a banner advocating for independence for Hong Kong. Anyone convicted of trying to split the territory from the rest of China now faces life in prison. Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam said the new legislation will restore stability. And no, it won't. I'm sorry, it won't. In the last op-ed published in the Anthroth newspaper, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson urged Israel not to go ahead with its formal annexation of portions of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley, which Netanyahu has said could start as soon as today. Johnson said he immensely proud of the UK's support of the founding of Israel, but it will remain unfinished business until there is a solution which provides justice and lasting peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. You are now up to date. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, excellent. So, those are the headlines. I'm actually shocked by the last response. The fact that Israel is taking that, the fact that the UK, who is almost ideologically aligned with the United States, to take a cadence and position that, yeah, you need to resolve this issue, and we don't like the way you're going about resolving it, and the annexation is a fail to us. Now, the catch becomes, this goes to your point once before, that your desire for something is not necessarily manifest if it just stays as a desire, even though that's the primary state of operation before anything gets changed. So the actual question becomes, are they going to do anything real and tangible about it, other than just kind of sending this letter and wringing their hands over this issue. What do you think, Shane?
I think that this is really meaningful, but I don't know what it means. I mean, as far as I can tell, other than the U.S., the U.K. is Israel's chief sort of international ally, and this is a big step. Again, like he's saying in the editorial, it was Britain that signed the Balfour Declaration that basically authorized the state of Israel. So they're foundational to this problem, and the nature of the modern problem, it's older than modernity, and I'm being very confusing here. This is an old problem between the Israelis and the Palestinians. This has been going on for decades, much longer than I've been alive. The nature of this problem is not new. So it's interesting to see this coming out now, right before there would be this decisive annexation. And I don't know what that means, but it does seem meaningful. It does seem like that's consequential in some way. We'll see if that actually gets responded to, how Netanyahu pushes back against that, which of course I'm guessing he's going to. But I'll also note, this is Netanyahu's been facing a lot of political trouble at home. I mean, within the last year, he was under threat of charges. There was this whole political fracas over the elections, trying to form a coalition government, this whole thing. I don't know that much about it, but I know all that stuff's going on. It'd be great to talk to somebody sort of factually on the ground in Israel about what's going on with Netanyahu, about this annexation. I'd love to have that conversation. But like you were pointing out, this is an interesting thing to see happening, and I think it is going to be consequential. It's just what those consequences are going to be.
I just don't think nothing comes of it. I mean, the European Union has wrung their hands on all sorts of issues. I mean, look back to the Iran deal, JCPOA, and you had all of these countries that basically signed up and says, yes, we will be a part of the JCPOA. We will stand with Iran and the United States in being this kind of impartial, objective observer to get down to the point of who's right and who's wrong. Then Trump gets in office, shoots the JCPOA in the face, and Europe shakes his fist at Iran because Iran basically made the point of, well, if the United States is not going to abide by the agreement, why should we? With Europe saying, no, you should abide by the agreement regardless. How dare you pull out of the agreement? Talking about Iran now, saying modest disagreement, frowning upon the United States for doing it, but not actually doing anything tangibly about it. I mean, this is Europe being impotent. The entire European Union and the size of that nation, or the size of that continent, I don't quite understand how that's even a continent, but the size of that continent basically saying, we don't like this, and the United States saying we don't care. And Europe not having any power or capacity to do anything real about it. So I don't have any expectation of anything to happen here as long as the United States would always keep its patsy nations like the UK in line. Am I wrong? Am I missing something on it?
I don't think you are. I mean, another side of this is that the newspaper that this op-ed was published through, that Boris Johnson's op-ed was published through, it's Yedioth Ahronoth. It's generally critical of Benjamin Netanyahu. So he's publishing it in a paper in Israel that's generally critical of Netanyahu. I could see that going in a couple directions, but to your point, I do see this sort of just being dismissed in Israel. But it's also, I don't know. There are a couple sides of this. How widely is this getting picked up in the UK? That's something I'd love to know about. Maybe we can have Patrick Henningson on sometime soon to talk about this. See what pushback is playing out there. I don't know. It's a complicated thing.
It is a complicated thing. Also, we must remember that the UK is uniquely responsible for the situation that we have at this moment. Back during World War I and after World War I, the Brits, who were in trouble, was promising everything to everybody in order to try to win the war. Well, one of the things it was promising was an Arab nation. And they were promising an Arab nation at the exact same time that they were basically promising an Israeli nation. So somebody in that was always going to get screwed, and it just so happens to be the Arabs. Now, this process picked up big time after the Second World War, when at that point, this process almost became somewhat systemic and finalized without necessarily having any word from the Palestinians who was living in that area. So this wasn't a crisis that goes back a millennia. No, this is a crisis that goes back within the course of modern history. Jews were living with Palestinians in the Palestinian territories without any issue. It was the taking of it that created the consternation. And on that, Britain is uniquely responsible. Yeah, we do need to get someone on for the history of that. I would love to get Galloway to talk about the creation of Israel, the history of the country, the strife that came after it, because it's a fascinating story that, it's like if we were living back during the time of colonization of America, and we would see all of these Native Americans getting wiped out. Now, if the news was reporting that from the perspective of America, what would they say? They would say that there was incursions from the Native Americans onto our territory, and we would take this ideological stance that those Native Americans are somehow violent and ruthless and threatening, and that we have to put them down, and you have reports about putting them in prison. And basically, we would create a system of understanding that they are somehow wrong and that the acquisition of that land is somehow right. We did it with slavery, where we can create an entire system based on this notion that holding this African American, he wasn't a real person, and therefore it's okay. Well, Israel is doing the exact same thing right now. We are basically seeing a colonization in modern history. So it's fascinating. And yeah, maybe we need to get, kind of like we did in the North Korean War, get involved in this one too.
I think that'd be a great way to do it. I mean, the other thing that comes to mind, just things that I know about the area, there's also Genie Energy and the oil under the Golan Heights. And there are a lot of people on the board of Genie Energy in the West. There is a Rothschild on the board of the company. And again, if you look back at it, the Balfour Declaration was signed by Arthur Balfour in a letter to the Lord Rothschild. So there's this, there's this through line. I don't want to make too much out of it, but I do want to note that. And again, looking at it these days, there is this big profit incentive for this company to get access, unrestricted access to this sort of unofficially annexed region of Syria, that Israel has basically de facto taken over and is occupying. So that's, again, there are these significant economic incentives, not to mention the wider geopolitical thing. Again, the neocons have been pushing for decades, having Israel as a sort of quote unquote bulwark. I'm not actually sure who I'm quoting there, but that idea, having Israel as a sort of force in the region that we can depend on, that whole thing is still in play. But again, Trump has tried to pull back. Trump, a longtime friend of Israel, is very supportive of the Israeli government. Again, embassy moved to Jerusalem. That was a big sort of coup in that relationship, a big booster to that. But he's also pulling back. Again, Trump, his candidacy, a lot of it based on not just economic return to productivity economically in the United States, but this sort of wider American isolationism move. That was at least what he was going for in his campaign promises. Now, if we do that, where does that leave Israel? So it's this complicated basket of apparent contradictions that I really don't know how to resolve. And in some sense, that's just politics, because you got to make all these compromises. But in another sense, looking at it, trying to figure out where the heck we're going, I don't know. But it is interesting to see this coming out. My last take on that.
Yeah.
Regardless,
interesting.
You know what? We're going into an open segment here. We're going to be taking calls in this next segment. Number, if you want to call in, is 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. Welcome back to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. You can listen to us live in Washington, D.C., 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. Or if you're in Kansas City, you can check us out, 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you want to, you can also listen to us online. Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Apple Music, iHeartRadio, often Periscope. These are just some, probably most, if not all, of the platforms you can find us on. Regardless, though, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're back. We're taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is the number. We have a couple people already on the line, but we have slots open, so feel free to call in. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Regardless, though, I'll go to EJ in Florida first. EJ, you called in yesterday. Welcome back to the show. What's on your mind, EJ?
Hey, how's it going? I'm actually responding to you. Hey, Jamarl and Shane, both of you. Shane, you posed the question yesterday about how much it would actually cost taxpayers to keep prisoners in jail. And the answer is it doesn't really cost too much. It's kind of a self-sustaining system. What happens is corporations, they get together and they pull their money together. As far as private prisons are concerned, they'll pull their money together and they'll go to certain states. And with those states, they impose quotas and mandatory occupancies. And in some states, if they don't fulfill those occupancies, they'll sue the states. They have people working for $1 a day. They produce money. The prisoners actually produce the money that's being used for their food. If you talk to anyone who's been in a jail, they don't spend money on these people. They're in there dying in jail cells, in prison cells. It's just a business. They impose the mandatory occupancies. They sue the states. In some cases, they actually get with judges. I don't know if you are familiar with the judge, Mark Ciavarella Jr. He was convicted. He was a Luzerne County judge, and he was convicted because he took $1 million in bribes from developers of juvenile detention centers, and he presided over those cases. And he would send those kids to those detention centers. And it was known as
this was the one that sent that kid to prison for throwing a ham sandwich, right? Like the kid threw a sandwich at Linga. He sent the guy to prison. It didn't matter what the kids did, he would give prison time. And they would forget about the time that the kids were in there. So it's like the kids would end up spending longer times in jail or whatnot. Yeah, that was pretty egregious. I remember that.
Yeah, and they get people in jail just for frivolous anything, and that's what happens when there's an offer that includes a demand that the prisons remain 90% full for the duration of an operating agreement. It means that if there's a low crime rate, then that's when taxpayers pay money. So I don't know if you remember when a cop was coming forward saying that they had quotas. They played that real tight to the vest because prisons, they will say, hey, if you don't keep these occupants, if you don't keep them full, we're going to make you pay money. So what happens is you have a conviction rate. Prosecutors have conviction rates where they'll say, if you talk to any, not a prosecutor, they don't like to admit this, but states like to keep a conviction rate of 90 to 95%. Well, what happens if people aren't committing crimes? Well, then it funnels down. It's kind of like this Keynesian style of encountering people. And then the police, it pushes for them to get people with those frivolous, nonviolent crimes. That's why you did a video not too long ago, Jamarl, where it was a cop. He was like, damn, I don't got nothing. I don't have anything. He's planting drugs on people. It's pressure from the top down to fill those prisons with slave labor for these corporations. It's funny because even in that case with the judge who got the $1 million, those corporations are protected. We didn't hear about those. We just heard about one of the judges, and they had to throw out 4,000 cases. It's a self-sustaining system. It doesn't cost taxpayers money for those prisoners. We don't spend anything. Abraham Lincoln, when he made the Emancipation Proclamation, he didn't want to free. He actually said, if I could save the Union without freeing slaves, I would do it. That's a direct quote from him. In multiple cases, he talked about black people not being equal. Another quote, I'm a little uneasy about the abolishment of slavery in this district. And he was talking about the District of Columbia. He was not a proponent. He wanted to protect white people from revolts because the Haitian Revolution, because Jamaica. There's too many examples to know that you cannot keep people slaves. It goes against a natural way of things. What God gives you, nobody can take away, in my opinion. Free will, freedom. People will eventually fight. And it was the easiest way is to make them your friend. He said this. He was a very duplicitous person. He was an evil, intelligent person. But that was the best way to maintain the system of slavery. That's why those penal colonies turned into penitentiaries. But that's just my answer to his question, and I'm trying to keep it brief, and I'm not cogent because there's so much information. I know I have a limited amount of time.
No, EJ, that was great. Please stay on the line for a second, if you will. I actually wanted to ask you, do you have any recommendations for books, documentaries, other sources that people can check out to learn more about this stuff, including myself?
Yeah. Oh, holy crap. Can I call back later today and give you a list, because I actually have like a recommended reading list. There's
Absolutely.
a ton.
Yeah, we're going to be open again, taking more calls at 9:15 in about an hour. So if you want to call back in, then we'll be waiting. But thanks again for the call, EJ. Really appreciate it. We also have next up on the lines, we have Martin from Virginia. Martin, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Later today and give you a list, because I actually have like a recommended reading list.
Martin, just got to interrupt you real quick. I don't know if you're on speaker, but we really cannot hear you. So if you can switch from speaker to your headset or just using the phone or something, I'm guessing that's what's going on. Try again now though, if you've switched over.
Repeat what you said.
Okay, now I can hear you. You were very unclear, but now I can hear you. Martin, what's on your mind?
Am I on the air, or am I just listening to the screener?
Martin, I'm sorry. Can you please repeat that? We might have to cut you if this. We're just having a very hard time hearing you. Yeah, I'm sorry. We can't do that. Yeah, that's completely inaudible. Martin, maybe try back in, calling from another phone or something like that with another connection, but it's very hard. There's kind of an echo thing going on. Regardless, that was a great call from EJ. This is stuff, again, there's so many things I've got to learn more about. What he was saying about the private prison system makes a lot of sense. I've heard a lot about the abuses of the private prison industry, and the fact that it pays for itself. I need to sort of vet those claims. I want to look into it a little bit more, but that seems like a big thing there. I'm also curious. I know that there is this. I want to know when that stuff started. I also want to know what the justifications were at the time for switching from a public to a private system. I'm guessing people were focusing obviously on the cost to taxpayers, but if there's this persistent legacy of people using imprisoned people to do labor, and if this is, as it seems to be, an extension of slavery, then I can, again, this stuff is in some sense all a revelation to me. I want to be looking really, really more deeply into this stuff. That's a bit rambly, but still, that's where I'm at with this.
But no, it's a fair point. I mean, think of what they were doing to immigrants. I mean, they would take immigrants who they were basically deporting, have them in prison cells, and those guys forcing them to work. And what happens if they don't work? What happens if they don't like the conditions to which they're working in? They have no agency in that process. And basically, those guys are effectively slaves. I mean, what is a person who's making 8 cents an hour? 8 cents away from slavery? And not to mention, like I said, they don't have the worker protections and everything else that's afforded to people who are basically working in jobs. I mean, it's utterly horrendous. And if you think about the companies that are able to profit off of prison labor, well, those companies, again, in California, they were paying like 8 cents an hour. And so if that company is using, or for the matter, that state is using those employees, what did Kamala Harris say, or her department say? Well, we need these people who are in these prison cells in order to fight fires for us, or for that matter, to do some kind of work. Because if we paid for that work, it would be too expensive to cover. Meaning we could get away with this cheap labor because this cheap labor gives us something that if we had to pay for it, the state would be on the hook to pay for it. It would be too much. So yeah, it does to some degree, despite the billions that it costs, also reap some kind of benefits.
And it's this weird, tangled, sort of thorny moral issue, because the arguments that you'd hear in favor of this, I've heard them, and I'm sure that these are the sort of main arguments. You have prisoners in prison. You should put them to work, so at least they're doing something beneficial for society. Now, my response to that is to say, well, you're creating an incentive to lock people up because you get cheap labor, And there's this whole system. All the conversation, in a weird way, I could see room for this on the right, a conversation against private prisons on the right. And here's how I'll put it. People on the right are talking constantly, and I've made these points. They're valid points to make here, about immigration and the role of immigration in depreciating wages in the U.S. You're basically lowering the value of labor by bringing people in from another country. Interestingly enough, I've also heard quite a bit of Marxist critiques of this. So you're driving down the value of labor. That's deleterious to the quality of life for the people in that country. There's this other argument specifically with Mexico that, by taking this, not necessarily brain drain thing, but by taking people away from their country, there's less of an incentive for them to invest in local institutions, like local governmental and political institutions, and economic institutions, forming businesses, increasing local productivity, and that creates this vicious cycle where they're sort of constantly deprived as they come over here. So that's a whole slate of issues. Again, you can look at this, different areas of the world this problem applies. In Europe, you'd argue that it's more people coming from North Africa, refugees in some cases, from the Middle East in some cases. Regardless, so that's a whole set of problems. Then we turn back to the United States. You look at the prison population, and the exact same thing is going on. If you have this private prison system, well, what is that doing if not decreasing the value of labor outside of the prisons? You've imprisoned these people. You're making them work for very low amounts of money. Sometimes, I've heard people say these statistics. I didn't need to look into them for myself, but I've heard pennies a day, pennies an hour, that kind of thing, basically nominal wages. That's gonna deflate the value of labor. That's gonna lower wages across the board in the country, just however slightly, however large, just because of the very process that's happening there.
Yeah, I agree with you. We have Adam in Virginia. Let's go to Adam. Adam, what's going on? We have about 30 seconds,
Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for taking my call. All right, I will be as quick as possible. To piggyback off of the Kamala Harris statement, talking about now basically there's an economy to scale built off of that cheap labor from prisons. Similar fashion, the cocoa industry, about 60% of the world's cocoa is derived from West Africa, and all the big companies, I'll name Hershey's and Nestle, have made statements exactly the same as you said, that they can't afford to pay more because then it would cost too much in the grocery store for my Ovaltine, for example. And the cocoa industry is, in that particular part of the world, is based on child slave labor. It's been going on for about a decade or more.
Wow.
Yeah, that is very consistent with that's very consistent with other stuff that I've heard about this. Again, fitting into that last conversation, there's this whole conversation about outsourcing and offshoring, and for a while it was pretty far, as far as I can tell, I'm still pretty young, it was pretty far outside of public discourse. It wasn't that acceptable to have these kinds of conversations. Interestingly enough, Paul Krugman, the New York Times economist dude, one of the more notable economists in the U.S., back in, I believe it was early 2016, but it may have been late 2015, he actually started talking, this has just shocked me, I only found this out recently, he started talking about whether or not we're entering a moment where, I'm forgetting exactly the term he used, it wasn't isolationism, but it was this idea of protectionism, whether we're entering a protectionist moment. That's so interesting, because I think of Krugman as like this establishment economist. Now, he was saying this, and you can read the article, he was saying this in response to the rise of Donald Trump. So I see this opening. I see this space opening for us to have this conversation for a long time, as far as I can tell. Again, I'm kind of young. A lot of people on the right, this was the sort of far right position. We should bring the jobs back to the States. We should bring manufacturing back to the States. There were often accusations of xenophobia or this anti-immigrant tendency. But like you're saying, it's like if the bottom line is just lowering costs for consumers, not increasing wages for people in America, but lowering the cost of goods at the expense of people around the world, that seems pretty xenophobic to me. So I don't know. This is all complicated stuff, but it seems to me like we've been operating under this economic paradigm for a little while now. Pushes for free trade, pushes against these arguments. It's interesting to see that space opening back up. Regardless, though, should go into a break here. We're going to be joined in just a second by John Wood Jr., having a conversation about slavery, continuing some of this, I'm sure. Regardless, though, we'll be back in just a minute. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Shane Stranahan. I am joined by Jamarl Thomas, my co-host. We're coming to you live just outside of Washington, D.C. If you're in the area, you can catch us on the radio. We're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If you're in Kansas City, you can also listen to us on the radio, 102.9 FM and 104.7. You can also find us online. We're on YouTube, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, Spotify, and Periscope. And so we're all over the place. You can catch us on any of those platforms. Regardless, though, with all that advertisement out of the way, we are joined now by John Wood Jr. John Wood Jr. is a former nominee for Congress. He's a contributor at Quillette Magazine. He's also a national ambassador for Braver Angels, which is America's largest bipartisan grassroots organization dedicated to political depolarization. John, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Hey, I'm doing terrific, and it's great to be on with you guys.
It's great to have you back. Yeah, so we're going to have a conversation with you, sparked by this wider protest movement we're seeing in the United States about slavery, about reparations. Should be interesting. But I'm curious. You've probably been on the line the last couple of minutes. We were having a conversation about economics, protectionism, free trade policies, and the value of labor and how the value of labor affects quality of life. It's a big conversation. If you were listening in, though, I'm curious, do you have any opinions on what we were talking about there?
I have to be honest. I was only catching little snippets of what you guys were saying. I'm over here on the West Coast. It's 5:30 in the morning. I usually get up at 4:30, but during this time, I'm in my getting ready for the day mode. So I was just I was in and out with you.
Absolutely, no harm. Absolutely, no. That makes perfect sense. And thank you, goodness knows, for getting up so early to be with us. Really appreciate that.
Not a problem, man. Early bird catches the worm.
Absolutely. Actually, before we get into it, I think we're going to be talking about slavery, reparations, how slavery built U.S. wealth. And I'm curious, though. This is the first time we've had you on the show. In the last incarnation of Fault Lines, you were on with Lee and Garland. This is Jamarl and I. Can you please tell us a bit more about Braver Angels right up front? Because that seems like it's going to be a good foundation if we understand that for the rest of the conversation. What are you guys trying to do over there? What's your motivation?
Yeah, sure. That'll give a little bit of context for how I tend to go about framing these social and political issues. So Braver Angels is the nation's largest grassroots and bipartisan organization addressing the work or dealing with the work of political depolarization. So what we seek to do is through programs, through media content, through in-person dialogues and events, set the foundation for the American people to develop a deeper, more personal understanding of one another's experiences as a means of, one, fostering relationships, and two, leveraging those relationships towards actual political and social progress, not just in the national political climate, but on the ground in local communities. So we're a membership organization. We've got thousands of members across the country. We've got dozens of local Braver Angels alliances, presences on college campuses, and of course you can find our work online, see us on social media, listen to our interviews on the Braver Angels podcast. We are a national community of folks drawn from across the aisle, addressing America's most potent and persistent divides.
So actually, I want to follow up on that real quick. That is all very cool. I'm into that. You said two key things that you're trying to do here. One, trying to create relationships across these divides, and then two, trying to leverage those relationships. So I can understand how you would do the first one. You're connecting people who have disparate beliefs, who might, the preconception might be that they're politically opposed to each other, that there's no hope of crossing that divide. And then you're trying to make those bridges, trying to build those bridges. The second part, I'm curious, how do you leverage it? What does it look like? What are you trying to do to get those conversations out?
Sure. So that works in a couple of different directions. And so we've got a variety of programs where the American people actually come together to meet, to dialogue, to debate issues, everything from small local workshops. I mean, right now everything is online because of the lockdown, but for everything from small local workshops where people basically engage in marriage counseling exercises between Republicans and Democrats to facilitate sort of intergroup understanding, to larger debates that incorporate dialogues over particular policy issues or political issues that let us hash things out. But we do it, of course, in a spirit of camaraderie and sort of the collective pursuit of truth. But after having participated in these programs, participants and members get an opportunity to join what we call Braver Angels Alliances, which are situated in local communities from Austin to Ohio, et cetera, et cetera. And in these Braver Angels Alliances, our members have the opportunity to talk about issues of concern in their state, in their city or municipality, and where we have bipartisan consensus that a certain policy could be supported, or a certain policy could be drafted, or some other issue of community engagement, community development could be gone into. That alliance is then empowered to act on that under its own umbrella without the direction of Braver Angels National. Now, at the same time, with respect to national politics, we're increasing our engagement with members of Congress, with their staffs, trying to bring our programs into the halls of power in D.C., but also in state capitals across the country. And so we try to have an institutional impact on that level of things as well. So we're really sort of looking at every sector and trying to take relationship, as you noted, and move it forward into the actual areas of application here, both from local governance on up.
That's interesting. You know, there's a lot more. I kind of want to get into that. But yeah, Jamarl, go ahead. I think we should get into the conversation. Jamarl, what's on your mind there?
Yeah, it's a good conversation that you guys are having, so I don't want to interrupt the conversation per se. I was going to ask John, basically, with all of the consternation that's taking place around the United States, what other areas of political compromise or political agreement have you found when you're bringing people together?
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, so our work, as I mentioned, is focused on the grassroots sort of domain. And what you find, I think, when you step outside of the formal political establishments, is that generally speaking, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of agreement within the American people, at least in terms of what the confines for a reasonable conversation happen to be with respect to our most pressing issues. And so, I mean, what are some of those? Well, at the moment, it's hard not to think of criminal justice reform or police reform as being an area in which most Americans actually have a sort of a clearly overlapping sense that there is room for reform in the area of police training. There's room for reform, potentially depending on the local circumstance, in the sort of reallocation or redistribution of funding in a way that might provide a little bit more support to social services relative to law enforcement. But on the other side of that coin is that most Americans, we find, see a role for law enforcement and don't necessarily want to disband it outright. And that sort of points to the sort of predictable and still nevertheless sort of tragic line of delineation between the way in which we simplify and demagogue issues in the national conversation versus the nuance with which people in grassroots communities are capable of engaging these dialogues locally. Because when you take a term like defund the police, it sets off a debate across America over this question of, whether or not we should abolish police departments entirely or whether or not we should, maintain the status quo. And again, the vast majority of Americans fall somewhere in between those polarities. And yet, you see exactly. And yet you see these polarities sort of defining the terms of the larger conversation. Why? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the media establishments and the political establishments are sort of rooted in a polarization model wherein ratings and perhaps votes are garnered ultimately by driving people to the greatest emotional extreme possible on a given subject, because it solidifies our opposition to one another as American citizens, and therefore solidifies a base of support for these different sorts of political media institutional structures. And yet, again, the American people, particularly when given the opportunity to communicate and interact with each other on a level playing field where the framing is such that we're focusing on goodwill and the common good rather than just political victory at all costs, the American people are capable of a great deal more wisdom than what you see demonstrated in so much of cable news and talk radio and the internal sorts of political party conversations. Not throwing you guys in that list, of course, but we've got a larger problem in there.
You're absolutely right. You're 1,000% right. When you look at media, they have a lot of conflict because conflict drives their bottom line. I mean, if two people are just sitting there agreeing, the people say, all right, this is not that interesting to me. However, if that guy has a knife, whatever bleeds leads, or whatever catches on fire, we're going to focus on it. Not necessarily trying to focus with the purpose of trying to create some kind of connection, but more so, like you said, division. Well, one last point, the polling. One of the things I've noticed is this kind of magnificent shift in polling in a very, very short period of time. How have you been experiencing that on the ground when you're having these meetings? Because there seems to be, all at once, this kind of recognition of the other side of history that was kind of being ignored in the pursuit of putting, let's say, like Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill or having up that Confederate statue. What has been your perspective of that shift in the polling or in the skew of the American population reconciling itself with its history?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the great positive potential of the moment that we're in, and I say this as a person who, I'm African American. I'm half African American, half Anglo American, but I'm a person who's considers himself deeply rooted in the Black experience and in Black history, and without subscribing to all of the mainstream analyses of what's wrong with Black America, I nevertheless feel that Black America has been beset by a unique set of circumstances, not just historically, but also contemporaneously, that make the struggles of Black America in the present moment something that urgently need to be addressed and yet have never been sufficiently recognized in the mainstream conversation. And so in as much as that suddenly seems to be changing almost overnight, there's positive potential to this moment. Now, my concern about this moment is that in our zeal for addressing, not just the legacy of historic injustice, but the injustices that real or perceived that people are looking at now, that we might sort of like a battering ram, charge through all the nuances of our current reality, and also in doing that, try and shut other folks out of the conversation who maybe are not people of color, but who still are, have a valuable role to play in a dialogue between equals as to what social progress looks like. So that's my concern, is that, we might be getting up a certain head of steam here, pushing forward with a certain sort of ideological agenda. It might be, aiming at something good in many respects, but that we might do that in a way that actually ignores complexity and sets us backwards instead of forwards, if we don't pursue this course wisely.
John, this is Shane here. Quick question. Yeah, quick question on that, actually. Whether it's on the left or the right in these local conversations that you guys are facilitating, I'm curious on this issue of racial injustice, economic inequality tied to, the history, but also, as you said, contemporaneous issues. What's surprising you in these local conversations, whether it's coming from the left or coming from the right, per se, as such? What are you taking away from this?
Well, so at Braver Angels, we've sought to facilitate conversations across the political divide here, but also across the racial divide. And as we move into the month of July, I'll just let you guys know, Braver Angels is launching a 2020 campaign that is built on sort of helping to guide the American people through this election through an ongoing series of programs that provide venues for folks to have these discussions online in both large groups and small groups, and debate formats and discussion formats, et cetera, et cetera. And so we've already started with some of these dialogues. I guess what surprises me is just the sort of degree to which very intelligent people on both sides of the partisan and racial conversation, speaking specifically in terms of black and white there, what surprises me is the degree to which very intelligent people can know their own points of view very well. Folks on the right can have a very sort of strong sense of the ways in which identity politics can, abrogate.
I have to apologize. I want to interrupt, but I want to take your answer in full coming back for the next segment. We're speaking to John Wood, former nominee for Congress, contributor to Quillette magazine, and national ambassador to Braver Angels. You're listening to Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Catch all the breaking global political and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that putting in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my disembodied co-host, Shane Stranahan. We're also joined by John Wood Jr., former nominee for Congress, contributor to Quillette magazine, and a national ambassador for Braver Angels. Okay, John, I'm going to let you finish your answer. I apologize for the interruption. We were going to break. But, yeah, I'm going to let you finish your answer. Oh,
yeah,
go for it.
Absolutely. Well, no, you asked what surprises me about some of these local conversations, and one thing that is surprising, although I think I understand the reason for it, is just how it is that very intelligent people on each side of the partisan and racial divide have a very thorough understanding of their own sort of worldview and the implications of what they know to be true, but are oftentimes themselves surprised by how much substance they might discover in a personal conversation with somebody of a very opposing point of view. So, for instance, we'll have folks from the conservative side of the conversation speak eloquently and in an educated fashion about the ways in which cancel culture and the ways in which expressions of identity politics can abrogate free speech, and the way in which that keeps us from being able to sort of make good on the civic potential of the United States to actually sort of enlist the American people fully behind changes that might need to be made or arrive at greater clarity on things. And we'll talk about folks on the right and the center left. We'll talk about issues on college campuses and so forth, and how social justice has run amok in that direction. But then folks on the left, a lot of times will hear those statements and not realize that conservatives have experienced this kind of sort of shutting out on college campuses. Won't realize the ways in which white folks have a difficult time entering into conversations, even though when certain rules for participation on the basis of you're having white privilege or this, that, or the other, make you an unequal sort of partner in that conversation. A lot of times folks on the left won't appreciate just how big a problem that is for being able to get their own cause moving forward. And at the same time, folks on the left will talk about social justice, and they'll talk about, in eloquent and educated terms, about the sort of wide spectrum of obstacles to success of Black life in America are impacting their ability to succeed beyond just questions of personal responsibility. And generally speaking, when I hear those sorts of points being made, I'll see folks on the right in these conversations hearing points of information from folks on the left really for the first time. and having to reckon with a lot of these testimonies in a way that impacts their point of view. And why is it that intelligent people on both sides of this can be, when they communicate with each other directly, be hearing things of value for the first time with respect to issues that they've thought of themselves as having studied or at least been informed about for years? It's because most of us are communicating with each other through the middleman, again, of the media establishment, which is invested in providing sort of a characterized understanding of the perspectives and a piecemeal understanding of the perspectives that are coming through on the other side of the conversation. And so, it's only when you engage the American people directly as an American citizen that you start to get the whole picture.
That's so fascinating. I would have a conversation with a friend of mine named Brian. Brian was a right-winger, and him and I would go back and forth, back and forth. And one day, I asked him just bluntly, if your kid could go to school where you didn't have to have $50,000 debt on your back, or your kid could go to healthcare without having all of these bills on your back. If we were, let's say, the debt was the same, would you be okay with it? And his answer shocked me. He said, yeah. He said, basically, I believe the political system doesn't care anything about me, so I just believe that this particular political party leaves me to my devices. And so whether they're unfair, ethical, moral, whether they're going to do anything in regards to helping me, I just assumed they wouldn't. Now, that shocked me because he's basically making an argument that a lot of people make when they don't vote or anything else. That basically, I don't think this political system is doing anything tangibly for me and my needs, and so I'm extricating myself from the political system. With all of these people in the streets, and you have all of these people who basically, honestly, who's taken a similar temperament, and I strongly believe that a lot of the people who are out here in the streets are supplanting their own issues with our system, whatever that is, political, economic, and social, into this very specific interest of Floyd. Meaning, even though they're out there for Floyd, there are wider concerns that are driving them out into the public. Do you believe that's true? And more importantly, if you do believe that's true, what do you think about the issue of reparations? Now, this was an issue that it took me a while to get on board with politically, meaning I agreed with it in spirit, but I thought politically it was not going to go anywhere, and it would hamper the case of somebody like Sanders, who had these other issues that he was trying to address. So how do you see the issue of reparations? Let's go there. How do you see the issue of reparations? And how do you see that argument materialize between people of opposite political parties, and what has been the outcome?
Right, yeah. Well, now we plan on holding, so you guys know, we plan on holding a Braver Angels debate on reparations within the first few weeks of the next month. And so it'll be interesting to see hundreds of Americans crossing all of these divides to have this conversation directly. And if you guys don't mind me saying so, people can keep up with that at braverangels.org. But on the subject, first of all, I resonate with your analysis, because I hear you saying that the protests that have sparked up in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd have really sort of been triggered by that, so to speak, by the symbolism, I think, of Floyd's death as ultimately sort of representing a larger kind of systemic oppression of Black people. Now, having said that, there's still many folks out there who are, I think, pushing forward and making the case that, police, or at least operating under the clear assumption that police killings of African Americans in America is a rampant thing that needs to be addressed. And clearly the killing of Floyd and other incidents we can name are tragic and offensive beyond belief. There's not actually a lot of data to support the assumption that police killings of Black Americans, of unarmed Black Americans in particular, is epidemic in our society. But there's this larger backdrop of issues with the police department, of mass incarceration, of systemic problems in our society, and a long history of racism that connects to this that I think folks are responding to. So to the subject of reparations, yes, reparations is looked at as, I think, a means of there's a couple things to it. So I think that there is the pragmatic or political or policy argument for reparations as something that can do material good for the African American community. And then there's the question of reparations as a matter of atonement for historic injustice, right? so it's possible to look at this along two different tracks, and you're sort of hinting at it even in the way that you were talking about it, because you said that in spirit you're sort of with the idea, but the practical politics of it was something that you were skeptical of. I feel, yeah, right. I feel sort of similarly myself. On the one hand, I think that you can justifiably make the case that clearly the United States of America was founded in a way that was utterly at odds with the idealism of the Declaration of Independence, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In that context, slavery was a clear crime against humanity, and therefore it seems that certain recompense is justified. And you can extend that argument beyond slavery to note the fact, as many folks will, that from Martin Luther King Jr. to Hakeem Jeffries, and many other black intellectuals and others, that coming out of the Civil War, you had certain material amends made to former slave owners whose property was destroyed in the midst of that civil conflagration. You had during an earlier period in the country's history, you had land grants made, land colleges made to settlers out west that African Americans did not qualify for. Even in the aftermath of the New Deal in World War II, with the GI Bill and other public programs that were meant to help build up and succeeded in building up a historic middle class in American life, even black veterans weren't entitled to a lot of these benefits. And so, from slavery, and if you want to extend that argument through much of American history, there have been incidents in which the government has invested in the well-being and development of its white citizens and white communities, but not similarly in African American communities. Now, you can argue that affirmative action showed up, and that there are other things that have been done to represent investments along those lines. But to me, it seems like there's a clear moral case to be made for reparations. And yet, in the words of my colleague from both Quillette and from the 1776 Unites Project, young Mr. Coleman Hughes, who testified before Congress against a bill that was being considered for maybe just the study of reparations. Although I can't quite recall the specifics of the bill, but he said in his testimony, he testified opposite Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he said that acknowledging the sins of the past is important, but quote, he fears that our quote, desire to fix the past compromises our ability to fix the present. And so that tips us into the practical side of this conversation, because and that in two ways. On the one hand, reparations could conceivably take different forms. But if we take the most conventional sort of version of it, the idea of just a straight across stimulus cash payment to, folks of African descent in America, even if you cut past the question of who actually gets that, does that go to immigrants who suffered in Black experience, but who aren't the descendants of slavery? Does this go to middle class, upper class, Black folks, et cetera, et cetera? Cutting past all that, there's just a basic question to be asked in terms of how much direct cash payments actually do to ensure long-term prosperity or social growth among any group of people. I mean, apparently there's data to show that, the one of the major impacts of the recent round of stimulus payments in response to the coronavirus lockdown has gone sort of, disproportionately to, big screen flat screen TVs and other consumer items and so forth that, I guess good for jiggering up some spending, but don't necessarily serve confidence in the direction of thinking that such payments can establish long-term prosperity for a group of people who are largely still locked in the grips of poverty, right? And so there's serious practical concerns to be had about the long-term efficacy of a policy like that if part of our desired outcome here is to combat the historic legacy of racism through poverty, for instance.
That is the voice of John Wood Jr. John, that was a great conversation. We'd love to have you back on. We're going into a break, though, so sad to say we've got to cut it there. But regardless, John Wood Jr. is a former nominee for Congress, contributor at Quillette Magazine, and a national ambassador for Braver Angels, which you can check out at braverangels.org. You can also follow John on Twitter at John R. Wood Jr. John R. Wood Jr. Great show. We have another hour coming up. Thanks so much again, John. We'll be back in just a minute. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the capital of the ever-increasingly divided states of America, it is time now for the show that's bringing you more sides of the issues that matter, trying to close those deep gaps. In the independent corner, I am investigative theorist and political analyst Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever-vigilant, your burning ember in the darkness, political analyst Jamarl Thomas.
Together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, now that we've gotten the fault lines out of the way, let's get to the headlines. In the news, got 9 stories today. First up, in the United States, we've seen a rash of new coronavirus infections. No, not a rash, not a coronavirus rash, but a rash of new infections. We've seen over 40,000 new confirmed cases in the last day, also over 1,100 deaths. Anthony Fauci, the head of the United States' the White House's coronavirus response team, warned that the rate of infection could more than double to 100,000 new cases per day if we don't adequately contain the novel coronavirus. This follows comments yesterday from Fed Chair Jerome Powell to members of Congress. He said the path forward is, quote, extraordinarily uncertain, end quote. This also comes as Vice President Pence will tomorrow travel to Phoenix, Arizona, as a part of his tour of the nation's new coronavirus hotspots. You know what, actually, we have this clip. We haven't played this clip, but I want to get to it now. This is Vice President Pence talking about the situation we're in. Andre, could we please play that clip before we move on in the headlines here?
But to all of the American people, I say on behalf of the President of the United States and the White House Coronavirus Task Force that because of all that we've done over the last 4 months, we're ready. We're in a much better place than we were 4 months ago or even 2 months ago. Part of our briefing today will focus on the progress that we have made and our ability to respond to the outbreaks that we're seeing occurring in states, particularly across the South.
Yes, again, that is the voice of Vice President Pence. I'm going to beg to disagree there, though we can talk about that after we're done with headlines here. Regardless, though, again, he is traveling to Phoenix, Arizona, and that was a speech he gave before that visit. We'll be talking there today. Chinese scientists have identified and reported a new strain of H1N1 flu that is currently circulating in pigs in China. They're saying that this has pandemic potential, this new strain does. Swine workers have tested positive for antibodies to the new strain, although there are as yet no reported cases of sickness from this new strain in humans. In Colorado, former Governor John Hickenlooper has won the Democratic primary to run against the incumbent GOP Senator Cory Gardner. And in Kentucky, Democrat Amy McGrath has narrowly beat out Charles Booker in the state's primary, where she will now be running against prominent incumbent GOP Senator and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. In Oklahoma, voters on Tuesday, that's yesterday, approved a ballot measure to extend Medicaid to tens of thousands of poor adults. They are the first state to expand government-backed health insurance during the pandemic. Today, NAFTA's replacement, the North American Free Trade Agreement replacement, is taking effect. This replacement is known as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, more widely known as the USMCA. It will expand and impact trade between the 3 North American countries. There are, however, a number of unresolved disagreements, notably between the United States and Mexico. Those disagreements include the Mexican government's failure to implement new labor laws, how quickly the Mexican government approves pharmaceuticals, as well as an IP law, an intellectual property law, that the Mexican Congress is considering that would be incompatible with provisions in this new trade deal. You may not believe it, and I kind of don't either, but Wall Street just saw its strongest quarter in over 20 years. The Dow recorded its best quarter since the first 3 months of 1987 with a 17.8% jump, while the S&P 500 logged its best quarterly gain since the final 3 months of 1998, climbing 19.9%. The Nasdaq Composite lagged very slightly behind with a 30.6% gain, giving it its best performance since the fourth quarter of 1999. After controversial new legislation was passed in Beijing yesterday and implemented in Hong Kong today, Hong Kong police have made their first arrests during demonstrations against the law. The first arrest was of a man holding up a banner advocating for independence from Hong Kong, or for Hong Kong from China. Anyone convicted of trying to split the territory from the rest of China now faces up to life in prison. Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam says the new legislation will restore stability. And in our last story, in a last-minute op-ed published in the Yadioth Aranath newspaper, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson urged Israel not to go ahead with its formal annexation of portions of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley, which Netanyahu has said could start as soon as today. Johnson said he is, quote, extremely proud, end quote, of the UK's support of the founding of Israel, but that it, quote, will remain unfinished business until there is a solution which provides justice and lasting peace for both Israelis and Palestinians, end quote. That's the news. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we're back out of that break. So that, I don't know, that Pence thing, man. I don't quite like that. He's trying to cover his butt. He did say, to his credit, he focused on how much better we're doing than 2 to 4 months ago, and I'm not going to disagree. We have many, many, many more tests in place. But he's also, again, obviously, as far as I can tell, at least from that short clip, he's ignoring the fact that we're seeing a rash of new infections. A lot of people are pretty worried about where this is going to go. And again, Fauci had just warned us that the rate of infection could more than double. It could get up to 100,000 new cases if we don't adequately contain the coronavirus. So it's, again, this set of mixed messages. Obviously, it's going to be politicized. People are trying to cover their butts. But it's all disconcerting. Anyway, that's my take on that. What's yours, Jamarl?
I think you're right. I mean, basically, the Trump administration has a basic problem. They're going into an election, and the public wholeheartedly blames the President of the United States and this administration for criminal incompetence and allowing this virus to get to where it is. I've often heard people make this assertion that, well, the World Health Organization, people weren't telling Trump, or China didn't tell Trump. We, in this country, had people in the World Health Organization that was relaying information back to us going all the way back to like January. We had the intelligence services giving us information on how bad it was going to be going all the way back to like December. It's no excuse for the United States to basically say that we didn't know, or it's China's fault or anybody else's fault. We did this. This was criminal incompetence by the administration at hand to not use the Defense Production Act, to not basically give people legitimate and genuine science, because instead he wanted to skate on this notion of that everything is doing right, everything is hunky-dory. I, the president, haven't necessarily made any big mistakes. I want people to look on the bright side of things. Well, it wasn't a bright side of things issue. It was an actual pandemic that you, as a president and the government of this country, needed to take prodigious action to avoid. And he, Pence included, who was supposedly heading up the COVID-19 thing, failed. Utterly, entirely, incomprehensibly failed. And 130 people have lost their lives because of such. So, yeah, all of these guys are trying to absolve blame of this particular issue and obfuscate their own failings in this by coming out with these statements like this. But they're politicizing this because, for obvious reasons, that they are trying to get out of being blamed for something that the public infinitely blames them on. And that's basically the outcomes of this COVID-19. And that's going into the election with the public looking at them as fault, or as people at fault. That's how I see it.
Another side, totally. Another side of this. I mean, I coming back to it, we were talking about it about a week ago. It happened a little over a week ago. Remember when Peter Navarro basically was talking about how the trade deal that we signed on January 15th, basically as soon as we signed that, when the plane wheels were taking off, that was when we heard about the virus. That was the first time we heard about the virus. And not only, he accused China of sending hundreds of thousands of people to this country to spread this virus. Before that time, I don't understand this. That's again egregious. We can use these kinds of words all we want. It sort of boggles the mind how we have so many irreconcilably different views of the facts not just opinions about the facts, but the actual facts. Again, Peter Navarro, economic advisor, that's stunning. What's your take on that, Jamarl?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, basically, they were arguing that as soon as these wheels went up, the COVID-19 started. as soon as there was some Chinese person that was just on the plane and it just infected America all at once the moment that the wheels were up. It's nonsense. It's utter and complete nonsense. But again, this is a country that has lost all legitimacy and all ability to take care of its needs or its basic responsibilities. Well, you have 130,000 people that died of this virus. You have China with 3 times our population and less infection rate. You have even the UK and some of the European nations that basically have gotten control of it, with the United States being radically out of control. Again, incompetence. And so these guys are trying to find every political answer in their toolbook to try to make it seem like it's okay. So one of the dodges is, well, we're doing more testing now. Yes, you can test everybody in this country all at once. And if you didn't have a material increase in the disease or the virus, those numbers for hospitalizations wouldn't budge. The fact that you have hospitals being overrun gets across that no, this is not just an optics thing. This is not just a more testing thing. This is really a material increase in the number of people with illness and disease that have been flooding your hospitals, flooding your ICU units, with the president trying to pretend and tell people, don't believe your eyes. There is no spoon. No, there's a spoon. And in this very specific case, these people are dying as a result of the president's actions. That's, I mean, really what it boils down to. These guys just don't want to deal with the honest realities of their reactions. And people have died because of it.
That's politics as usual these days, man. Yeah, that's what's so frustrating about this stuff. It's managing appearances. And you're right. You know what? We actually, the United States just passed over 100,000 deaths. 130,000 deaths. So just in the last day, we've gotten to over 130,000. Again, I can't. You put the scale of that problem, which you can't even imagine. No single person can hold that many people in their minds at one time. But you try to hold that up against the kinds of communications we've been seeing on every side. Again, as far as I can tell, with zero exceptions, you've been seeing varying degrees of misinformation about the virus in any number of directions. Downplaying the masks, and then arguably, we didn't get to this, but we were talking with Mikhail Kogan earlier about the masks. He's recommending, and it makes sense, you shouldn't be wearing these things while you're heavily exercising. They do slightly restrict oxygen flow. Shouldn't there be like public advisories? Shouldn't we all know that? Like, if, in other words, if you had a picture of how this whole thing got laid out, people would know, okay, masks are useful. They're not perfect. They block some droplets, but not others, but they are useful. You should probably get them, but you probably should wait to get them because, we haven't ramped up our capacity, and really the people who need them the most are in these hospitals. And if you're going to wear them, wear them when you're in crowded spaces, wear them when you're indoors with strangers, people you don't live with. You probably you don't need to wear them too much outside. Like, as far as I can tell, some of that, like there's this point, some of that you might want to wait until you see the course the coronavirus takes. But I can also see, again, this might sound a little bit idealistic, I can also just see us getting out ahead of it, giving facts, being honest with people, not misdirecting them. And that seems like such a better way to be than the status quo right now.
Yeah.
Anyway, that might be over idealistic. Yeah.
No. I mean,
anyway,
I think it is, but credibility is a problem right now. And the only way you can deal with credibility is through honesty. The only problem that I have is that honesty sometimes don't necessarily have gains that go along with it in regards to like a perfect world. I mean, we have a decision space that is narrowly constrained based on bad actions that the people in charge have been taking. And so we're stuck in this kind of horrible bad options issue where the good option under normal circumstances may lead to a good outcome, but in this situation, it may actually not.
Yeah, we have all these bureaucracies that are totally disentangled from what they should be doing. You have people who are out of reality, and there's this incentive to lie. Again, not in every case. I'm not saying that everything these people are saying are lies, but I'm saying when they need to, when they feel that it's right to do so, there are all of these incentives set up to keep them telling mistruths or just direct lies to people. And that's the real crisis of authority in this country, at least one of them. It's the slate of lies, arguably started with geopolitical stuff because in some sense, some would argue, and some did argue, you have to lie. But arguably you don't. Arguably you also kind of come clean. You do the right things internationally. You clean up quickly. And I don't know. There's just this history, this unending train beyond living memory, as far as I can tell, of lie after lie after lie, large and small. And it's no wonder that things are falling down in terms of legitimacy. Regardless, we're going to go into this next segment here. We're going into a break. We're taking calls. EJ, we have on the line. We'll come to you in just a second for the reading list you called in about last hour. Really looking forward to that. Have your pens and paper ready to take these recommendations. Regardless, we'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
It's time to double down with Max and Stacy.
Yeah, double down. We're talking markets, finance, business, economics, ka-ching, bling, just about everything money related on Sputnik. It's called Double Down.
We're asking, are dead cats bouncing or have fundamentals changed? That's this week on Double Down.
Fault Lines.
And welcome back to
Fault Lines. No, I'm sorry. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my disembodied co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from our station in D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and in D.C. and 104.7 FM. Also, if you're digging what we're putting down, whichever platform you're consuming this content on, give up the like and share this video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, tweet, and of course, reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. And we have a caller on the line already, EJ.
Hey, how's it going? I just came back with that list. I could break it down into sections if you'd like, but I could get started. I also, Jamar, now, this is a question I always have, just getting this out of the way. I'm sorry. Am I enunciating the R or the L? I've been listening to you for years, and I literally bounce back and forth there. And I know it's been addressed, but Jamarl, or Jamal?
It's Jamarl. Yeah, it's typically Jamarl, but most people ignore the R because they don't necessarily want to get involved in the R. But it's typically Jamarl. When my mom named it, it's Jamal.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. But so the list I just have I have 10, and one is going to be the new American slavery, capitalism and ghettoization of American prisons as a profitable corporate business by David LeBird. From plantations to prisons, the legacy of slavery on black incarceration in the United States by Melissa Rubio. Slavery in the United States, in the U.S. prison system, And this is an article. The link is actually, I sent it to your email at JamarlBiz on your channel.
Okay. Yeah.
So all of these, there's going to be links to them if you wanted to. And let's see. So that one was an article, Slavery in the U.S. prison system, which is a quick one by Al Jazeera. Or on the Al Jazeera website, 4, How Unpaid Prison Labor is Powering Florida. Another article, you can go to that, freedomunited.org. 5 is Slaves of the State, Black Incarceration from the Chain Gang to the Penitentiary by Dennis Childs. 6 is Slaves of the State, and this is an article that appears in the Journal of Prisoners and Prisons, Volume 6, Issue 2. In 1995, and it's from pages 17 and 20 by P. Wright. 7 is Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II, David A. Blackman. 8 is Golden Gulag, Prison Surplus Crisis and Opposition in Globalizing California. This is by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. California has a pretty nasty history. You're going to learn about that in this. But at 9, Change Everything, Racial Capitalism and the Case for Abolition. And this is also by Wilson Ruth Gilmore. There's some documentaries that you might have heard of. The 13th, Hidden Colors. There's also, there's a bunch of peer-reviewed articles from, here, let me pick this up, actually, for Abraham Lincoln he has a pretty sordid past, and you'll find a lot of that stuff interesting. The Abraham Lincoln stuff, I only know about it, or I only looked into it because when I was a kid, my dad used to tell me this, and I used to just kind of gawk at him because it was completely contrary to what we would learn in school. And I got older and became more cognizant, and then started looking into it. It's like, oh, okay, this guy was a racist, and it was a very strategic move to end slavery.
Cool,
and I'm just
thank you,
pulling the
man.
reference.
Thank you for calling in. We're
EJ,
going to check
EJ.
out those books.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you calling back. I asked you to do it, and you took the time, and that was a great list. More than 10 there by my count when you started to include the documentaries, too. I was looking those up as you were saying them. Also, if anybody wants to send us an email, if you want to send us an email, no pressure. Of course, you just did all that work for us. But if anybody wants to send us an email with recommendations about stories, anything like that, you can. faultlinesradio@gmail.com is the sort of general account. My personal email address also, if you want to get in touch, shanestranahan@gmail.com. So just Shane Stranahan, no spaces, nothing weird there, @gmail.com. I'm always open to those. And I've gotten a few people. I've given out my email once or twice before, and I've had a few people I'd never heard of, getting in touch. We corresponded back and forth over the last few months. It's just been good. So regardless, anybody, I'm open to that stuff. But also faultlinesradio@gmail.com for the sort of group submissions. You know what? That was great. Thank you again, EJ. Let's go to Tarif. Tarif from New Orleans, you're on the line. What is on your mind?
I want to talk about Amazon. I was looking at the donations that they gave to different organizations. The ACLU Foundation, Black Lives Matter, Brennan Center for Justice, NAACP. So my thing is this. It's good that these large corporations given to these organizations, but will these organizations still stand with the working man and woman when these people ask for, if that's working at Amazon, if they want to ask for higher wages, better pensions or whatever when they retire, insurance, so forth and so forth. Well, it's one thing, it's good to be talking about police brutality and to reconcile that to have a board to stop it and to weed out the bad cops and whatever thing. But when it comes down to poverty, certain things still have to be addressed. So I wonder if these groups ever going to join the unions and the trade labor movements and the healthcare movement to benefit, people. So, would you bite the hand that's feeding you, basically? You see what I'm saying? It's something to think about. So that's all I wanted to say. I saw it yesterday when I was reading the donations from Amazon.
Interesting. Now, the catch is Amazon fought tooth and nail to prevent even a modest increase. Jeff Bezos is on its way to being a trillionaire, and Amazon, as a federal institution, basically paid for federal taxes, paid none. That's obscene when you think about it in those terms. You have 40 million people out of a job, about 30 million people without health care. Donald Trump is impeaching or going after, destroying the little health care that they have, trying to remove an additional 30-something million. And again, this is during a pandemic. And these companies have been taking the performative, demonstrative knee. Now, to your point, are these companies also going to stand by their workers and stand by their employees when you get into issues of poverty? And part and parcel to that is whether or not the private enterprise will have the capability of ensuring that people have a decent, meaningful job. And up to this point, the answer has been no. So, this question gets into government necessity, the responsibility of government in regards to dealing with the material welfare of the population itself, especially during a crisis like a pandemic, or for that matter, even to some degree, a wartime situation, which you can make a case that this number of people that are lost, this is a calamity of massive and epic proportions. But, in lieu of reality and rational action, you have obfuscation and propaganda. And unfortunately, that's what we've been seeing either from the federal government or, for that matter, companies that try to associate themselves with this intangible movement, trying to commodify the movement into something that they can make a profit off of. I don't know how they're going to pull this off, but I don't necessarily doubt that they will be trying. And companies like Amazon or Walmart or whatever these other companies are that's going to be bringing in billions, pay your employees. If you really want to stand with your employees and take a knee, pay your employees a decent wage. Pay your employees at least $15 an hour, especially when those employees are infinitely necessary for you to make your billions. Meaning you make nothing without those employees risking their lives to shop or to work at your stores, not to mention the people who risk their lives shopping at those stores, not to mention the federal system that includes making sure that you have an educated workforce or a healthy workforce, or for that matter, roads and schools, etc., etc. If you want to stand with your employees in this moment, pay them a decent wage and treat them fairly. Shane, what do you think about that?
I think it's complicated. I agree with it, but if we're going to do that, we've also got to focus on who Amazon is competing with. Amazon is competing in this system where the price of goods for Americans has been brought down by decades of our international trade arrangements and flows of investment and all this stuff. So it's like some things happen in binaries in a weird way, where if you have a system that's responding to something, or you have something that you're looking at in the system that's justified by other aspects of that system, and you kind of have to look at what else has to give for you to be able to fix this problem. So when I look at Amazon, when I look at what you're describing, that's what I think about. But you also got to look at the facts, like you're saying. You have to look at it straight in the face in order to be able to figure out what problems are actually going on. So yeah, it is egregious. Amazon should be paying their workers more. But again, this is you'd have to have that conversation, I think, for it to be reasonable and legitimate. You have to have that conversation at the same time as you're also addressing these other issues. Who are they competing with? What is the system that we've put into place, the U.S. government has put into place and maintained for the American people, including the workers, but also including Bezos as the owner of this company? We have to look at that side of things too, and that's where it gets real complicated. There's this whole there's this wider point. If we're living, if you look at academia, for instance, it's been arguably centuries since we've had any polymaths, anybody who's really understood the world's knowledge, just because things have gotten so darn complicated. You've had this intense specialization of fields. Some would say they should be less specialized, and there's a lot of stock to put in that. But at the same time, you just get this incredible profusion of knowledge that you have to make sense of in some way, and so you get this specialization of fields. Now, the same thing applies, I think, to our government and political systems in general, the ties between corporate systems, financial systems, and the governmental process. The ties between the military-industrial system and government. This stuff is really complicated, and I'm really pretty worried. It's not even worried because it's sort of settled into just a sense of despair. We don't have the tools, the intellectual tools, or the cultural momentum that I think we would need to do a successful analysis and reform of these systems. It's going to be hard. There's this idea of Chesterton's fence, where G.K. Chesterton, the writer, says, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but you come across a fence, and if you don't like something about the fence, maybe it's blocking your path, the first tendency is just to tear it down. That can be the first tendency, at least. But maybe somebody else put that fence up to keep, animals hemmed in some way. Maybe they have cows or something like that. Anyway, there's this larger question. Until you really understand a system, I don't think you're going to be able to effectively change it. And I think that's what we need, is to understand the system. Again, it's so darn complicated. And part of it, I'm going to close up here sort of, part of it is that I think it's been overcomplicated. You're talking about propaganda, obfuscation. It's been overcomplicated by misdirection, by deception. I think it's been intentionally complicated, and that's horrifying. You have this Byzantine system that's getting ever more Byzantine, arguably partly intentionally. And the potential to reform it goes down and down as the system gets more and more stagnant. That's my take.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you on something else also. I think the primary thing in this is a certain degree of a system that drives certain incentives, or that has certain incentives in the way that they operate. And the incentives breeds a certain degree of dishonesty in order to get advantage. I mean, basically, your options, regardless of what you're taught in your society by your parents and everything else, the reality is that there are virtues that are explained just in the basis of operation in the society and the goals and objectives that are given to you, and incentive structure built into it. Meaning, regardless of what people are basically being incentivized to take certain actions that are not necessarily to the best interest of the whole, but it's entirely to the best interest of the individual. That breeds a certain amount of disrepute and vagaries of our system. That needs to be changed. And I got to be honest, the decision space constrains the further out you get into the space, kind of like you're saying, Shane. But we're going to be back after this. This is Thomas and Stranahan. You're listening to Fault Lines. Back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my disembodied co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from the nation's capital of D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City, where you can catch us at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming, give up the like, share the content. If you want to be a part of this conversation, you can always reach us by chat, tweet, and of course, phone at 202-521-1320. So we have been having this prodigiously interesting conversation on reparations. People like me we're having this really interesting conversation on reparations. People often make the improper suggestion that they don't want to be punished for the sins of their fathers, but they're perfectly willing to accept the advantages of those sins, including the radical dispossession of wealth for 13% of the population that was violently and systemically disadvantaged. Truth of the matter is that the government made laws, and the government picked winners and losers, and incomprehensible losers at that. And frankly, the edifice that created the legal mechanisms for slavery, that institution is still present. You've known me on this channel take personal nuanced position that I agree with the logic of reparations, but understand the political difficulties in trying to pass such an expansive policy in a country that hasn't reconciled itself with this past in an honest way. Even among people that have changed their workable point of view in light of the protests, the question that is always brought up is expense. How do we pay for such a thing? I am so glad that you've come to the right place. To discuss, we're joined by founder of the nonprofit Real Progressives and host of the podcast Macaroni and Cheese, Steve Grumbine. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Hey, Jamarl. Thank you for having me on, sir.
Absolutely. Now, you haven't been on this particular instance of our show before. So basically, I'm going to ask you, from your perspective of the world, how do you view what has been taking place in the United States regarding these protests, and why do you think these people are legitimately out there?
Well, first things first, this has been brewing forever. I mean, this should have happened a long time ago, but it happens when it happens. I mean, the police, brutality that we've seen over and over again is but a small microcosm of all the ills that the United States have put on minorities and brown and black people in particular. And, it just finally came to a head. And I think also the perfect storm of a coronavirus that took away the bread and circuses that oftentimes keep us distanced from exacting the price of democracy allowed us a window to see what life would be like if we actually focused our attentions on the problems at hand. So I think that that's a big part of why you're seeing it happen, because of the timing of it. I think also it just was time. I mean, you've got a President Trump who has basically fanned the flames of people that had long since been buried in the dark shadows. We knew they were there, but they were in hiding. He coaxed them out of the shadows and into the sunlight, and they're letting their freak flag fly, so to speak. And, it was a perfect storm. It was the time. You had the Bernie Sanders campaign that was raising issues of inequality, raising issues of serving the public purpose once again. And lo and behold, it doesn't happen. And then you have someone die who is basically trying to survive. Let's just say hypothetically that the $20 forgery, counterfeit dollar was in any way, shape, or form being used to get by. You have to think neoliberalism in the situation that we're in right now creates a whole other economy, an economy of survival, an economy of just trying to make it through. And so it's very hard to imagine that being worth taking someone's life over. And in fact, that's what happened to George Floyd. So I think that whole cauldron of issues and economic inequality and police inequality and justice inequality came to a head and brought people out to the streets.
I think that's a really good point. I really do. I mean, I try to make the argument that poverty is often driven by economic, well, clearly it's driven by economic concerns. But poverty drives certain statistical outcomes that are horrendous, especially from a society that wants to remain rational in the context of looking after life, limb, and human health and happiness as a priority. So when we get to this notion of wealth and we get to this notion of a skew and the amount of wealth from one group to another group, you kind of have to look at why. And one of the vestiges of slavery just pop out. It jumps off the page, especially in the way that income inequality hasn't necessarily been able to balance itself. So when the argument of reparation comes up from slavery, assume for the moment that the public was interested in this. Assume for the moment that the public wanted to reconcile the vagaries of history in order to move forward in kind of a new day of sorts. How do we pay for it? That seems to be the answer to the question that always comes up. How do we pay for it? This seems to be radically expensive. Maybe we can't afford it. Can we afford it?
Well, we can absolutely afford it, and we absolutely must afford it. We can't not afford it. That's the thing. It's so important, and ironically, let me say this: it's important for white people, even those who have benefited from. Well, every one of us has benefited from, but the ones that are particularly benefited. It's important for everyone that slavery be atoned for, both in word and deed and in a financial way, because number one, there's so many things that are happening in our country that hurt everyone, not just black and brown people, but white people don't even realize how it hurts them. And by putting a healing ointment on this that brings people into a true, honest equality with equity and justice, we repair society in such a way that we all win. So I don't see any reason to push back on this other than an erroneous belief in how to pay for it. And so when you think about our financial system, the way that things work, we live in a modern fiat economy that is largely pieces of paper. And we've talked about this on other shows before, but this is a very important thing because right now, as we speak, so you know how far away we are on this, Bernie Sanders is advancing a 10% reduction in military spending. And because of the coronavirus, because after all, we're how are we going to pay for it, right? And he had the luxury of having many, many years of Stephanie Kelton at his side. And that's Stephanie Kelton being a leading voice in the economic school of thought called modern monetary theory, and her new book, The Deficit Myth, would have put all this to bed had Bernie read this, but he hasn't, obviously. And I know it's very, very popular to talk about cutting the military, but at a time such as now where you've got a major depression rearing down, people that are the black and brown people that we're talking about giving reparations to are going to be triply hit hard once the August payments stop, and people that were already living on the margin are about to be put out of their homes and lose jobs and stuff like that. It's a time like no other where the question of how are you going to pay for it is a matter of life and death. So reparations riding on the heels of that understanding, it's important to understand that reparations is far more than a cash payment. I spoke with a friend of mine, the funky academic. His name is Irami Osi Frimpong. And Irami put it out there like this: the money that we would be paying for reparations is earnest money. The real money, the real payback is the systems that have maintained the white supremacy in this nation, that have maintained the inequality at every level, from policing, as we've seen with George Floyd, and to all the other things, from education, the schools where they're poor districts, they're not funded properly, the kids are already starting off incorrectly. So reparations is such a massive undertaking, but it's a necessary one, and it's one that progressives should all be able to get behind. And I think, quite frankly, all humanity should be able to get behind when they do a decent, even just cursory examination of the facts.
Yeah, but how do we afford it? I guess that's what I'm getting at. Like, if somebody says a price tag,
we can afford it. Yeah, don't even let that bother you. Bottom line, all money in the United States and all fiat economies like ours, they create money with keystrokes. It's literally that simple. I mean, it's almost like it should be the only thing we don't really have to talk about, but we do. And that's the thing. When money is in the economy, people survive, people thrive, especially if it's distributed throughout the economy, not just pulled at the top. And so reparations is a simple matter of deciding what that amount of money is, whatever it is. And I'm not here to state what that should be. I mean, I think it's up to the victims of the atrocities to name their price. But whatever that is, we can afford it. There's no financial constraints whatsoever that would prevent us from being able to do this. The only concern would ever be is, do we have the real resources in this nation to provide for an economy that suddenly infuses that much money into it by giving those folks that money? Because the idea of white people paying taxes to fund reparations is a false narrative. And this is super important because you stated in your thing, you're taking from one to give to another. But that's not how this works. That's not how this works at all. And if they did try to say they're going to raise taxes to pay for it, it would just simply be window dressing to make people feel like they did. It wouldn't be a real thing. Taxes are deleted upon receipt at the federal level. So the idea of affordability is not an issue. And in fact, it would be good if we all got to a point where we started saying, what kind of society do we want? Not how do we afford it. The question Stephanie Kelton would say is, how do we resource it? So affordability for reparations is in no way, shape, or form a financial constraint. Now, I will tell you, the reparations that I speak of that go beyond the cash payments, that's a different story altogether. Because we're talking about, how do we pay for all these teachers? How do we pay for them in terms of, do we have the research? Do we have teachers? Do we have the schools? Do we have the supplies? Do we have the necessary goods and services that it takes to make that money matter to the people that we're giving it to? And that's a story of restructuring society to ensure that everyone gets what they need, get their needs taken care of. And I would answer that question with a yes, we can absolutely do it too. I think a restructuring of the military would allow for real resources to be unclogged and provide for those services. A job guarantee eliminates the need for the military to be the employer of last resort. There's so many structural needs to be able to make sure that the real resources are available. But from a financial standpoint, reparations is a non-issue. We could afford it yesterday.
This is Shane Stranahan coming in here, and we're about to go into a break. So I'll sort of set you up with this, give you a little bit of time to think about it, and then we can come back to it on the other side of the break. I had heard about modern monetary theory a few years ago, and granted, that's not the main focus of yours. What you're saying is that the financial end of things is largely irrelevant because, again, it's true. We are a fiat currency. We produce money out of nothing. There are consequences of us producing that money out of nothing, but it's true that that's sort of not the fundamental issue, at least as far as I can tell right now. But I have reservations, and again, I don't want to fixate on it too much, but I have reservations about that very idea, that we got into this position where we are now printing all that money, that there is this serious disentanglement, this disconnection between the money that we've produced and the resources that money should in some sense represent. There are also these questions about inflation, all this stuff. Regardless, though, I know that I don't know that much about this, and I want to get your take on it. I hear you're a proponent of it, but regardless, we'll come back to that. Maybe we can get into that a little bit deeper on the other side of this break. We're joined by Steve Grumbine. He's a political, economic, and social justice activist and founder of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. You can follow Steve on Twitter at Real Progressives US. Also SD Grumbine. Be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Tune in every Wednesday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker and John Kiriakou for a regular segment called Beyond Nuclear, where Brian and John discuss nuclear issues, including weapons, energy, waste, and the future of nuclear technology in the United States, with Kevin Camps, the radioactive waste watchdog at the organization Beyond Nuclear. Listen on Wednesdays right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Again, we're joined right now by Steve Grumbine. He's a political, economic, and social justice activist, and he's also the founder of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. It's a 501c3 and a 501c4, respectively, for each of those organizations. He's also dedicated to education and advocacy for modern monetary theory. That's where I turn to towards the end of our last segment. I'm going to put my bias right up here on the table. I come from this kind of weird background. It's a little bit irrelevant, but I'll just put it out there. My dad was a reporter for Breitbart, and on my mom's side, my stepdad is like a very prominent feminist blogger. My dad's on the right, my mom and her husband are on the left. And I love all of these people, and so I kind of came to this place. Anyway, my point is, I have the ability to see these different sides and to attempt, my inclination is to attempt to bridge these gaps. But my bias when it comes to the economic stuff is I'm kind of coming from this Austrian background. Not wholeheartedly, but I'll put it like this. Most of the guests we've had on the show, not by my choice, just by coincidence and what the host wanted, most of the guests we've had on the show on economics have come from this libertarian Austrian perspective. So that's sort of my bias, putting that out there. But regardless, I threw you a question at the end of the last break. Can we come back to that now? And can you give us, what is modern monetary theory? How is it distinct from neoclassical economics, neo-Keynesian economics? And just generally that issue, Steve.
It's asked a lot, and I got to give Stephanie Kelton a quick shout out. Her new book, The Deficit Myth, is easy enough for a non-econ person to read cover to cover in a day, and it will leave you with a clear understanding of the way things work. But in the very, very short period of time I have to answer that question, modern monetary theory is a lens, and what it does is it produces a framework for analysis, and it's largely driven from the post-Bretton Woods Accord, the free-floating sovereign, non-pegged, non-convertible fiat currency regime that we have today. Not just that the U.S. has, but the U.K. has, Australia has, Japan has, quite frankly, China and Russia and Canada, and many others that, unlike the Eurozone, we have unlimited policy potentials that we can look at based on being a currency issuer. And this is how it works today. Just full disclosure. And modern monetary theory is not something to be implemented. It's not something to be considered. It's not a belief. So whether you believe it or not believe it is kind of irrelevant. It's really a snapshot of how things work since we left the gold standard and how a fiat currency works in a modern economy. And so what they've done is they've come up with some what we'll call conjectures or hypotheses and theories that have been coherent. They're legally congruent. And what it does is it allows you to understand the real constraints, the real limits, the real way that a fiat currency works. So today, in the past, you've heard Milton Friedman, who was probably the father of a lot of your Austrian thinking, and von Mises and others, who talk about quantity theory of money. They oftentimes talk about you can't print wealth, you can't do this, you can't do that. Well, the difference is this. The United States government being the currency issuer, it is the price setter. By definition, the U.S. government accepts $1 in taxes for $1. I mean, it's 1 for 1, period. And so by doing that, it set the value of the dollar. And if you ever try to pay your taxes in Bitcoin, if you ever try to pay your taxes in Monets or Cubanos or anything else, you're not going to be able to pay your taxes, because taxes can only be paid in U.S. dollars. And so with that understanding, the monopoly issuer of the currency sets the price and basically creates the parameters by which the market thrives or fails. And you can see that in the United States now as we head into a Great Depression. When the U.S. government spends money into the economy, the states are okay, the municipalities are okay. The issue is distribution. When you spend at the top, when you give tax breaks at the top like Trump did, you starve the real economy from having actual fuel, from having lubricant, if you will. But when you spend it at the bottom, that money makes it through the entire economy. So the issue is, where do you place your tax? Where do you place your spending? But taxes literally don't fund spending. Taxes are simply a driver for currency to make you need that currency. And so this understanding of the way fiat currency works, that's not back to oil, that's not back to gold, that's not back to cotton, it's not back to anything. It's simply backed by the tax, the U.S. ability to levy a tax. It's in that vein that we derive the value of that money. So the government will buy goods and services because the purpose of the dollar was a tax credit to allow the government to provision itself. Ultimately, that's what we're dealing with here, is the ability to provision for the public purpose. And so if you take it back to reparations, you basically have an understanding that the government's job has always been, based on Article 1, Section 8, to serve the public purpose, and Congress has the power of the purse to spend that money into existence. The question becomes, because you always hear the Austrians talk about printing money, and we don't print money anymore. And not only do we not print money, but the idea here is that taxes are the drain. Taxes eliminate dollars from the economy. Spending puts dollars into the economy. And we've got two ways of getting dollars into the economy, and only two ways of getting dollars into the economy. One is the government spends it into the economy, or two, you go into debt and borrow money from a private bank. At that point in time, you get IOUs split into our economy versus net financial assets, which the government spends into the economy. So since the 1970s, the Austrians, who have largely won this battle, unfortunately, in my opinion, have put us all in private debt. So people are starving and drowning in mountains of private debt because they cut the spigot off for the federal government to spend on the people. That's why they always wring their hands and say, how are we going to pay for it? I don't know, Chauncey. I don't know how we're going to pay for it. But then they go ahead and blow $750 billion on the military while simultaneously giving a tax cut. It doesn't take rocket science to figure that out, but regular people live by the means of my household budget. So it resonates with regular people. You have long since been looking at their account and wondering where the heck all the money is. How is the federal government spending money? It doesn't have money. Why is my tax dollars going to this? Well, your tax dollars aren't going to that, because your taxes are literally deleted. So this is a fundamental disconnect. And you said it very well earlier, that disconnect between our tax money and the spending and so forth. And that is a disconnect. So the question...
Real quick to intervene, Steve, I'm sorry. We have about 5 minutes, give or take. Why, if none of that's real, though? I mean, whether it's backed by gold, whether it's backed by tulips, whether it's backed by, a dung beetle's output, whether none of those things are real in real terms from a standpoint of value. I mean, money is just a conceptual artifact, right? I mean, like MMT kind of makes that point that much more clearer in the way that it kind of addresses and approaches the notion of capitalism and the money that's created by the supply.
Absolutely. It picks and chooses winners.
Wow.
Absolutely.
That's fair. That's very fair. So what's our way out of this? Meaning, if I agree with you that, yes, the government can supply these things, the government can pay these things. Obviously, we've been spending that much on the military and been putting on our company, on the government's credit card. If that's true, then what do you think would be the outcome of something like that? And then do you even have a conception of how the government will go about doing that? or is that too expansive of a question to ask right now?
Oh, no. I mean, I can give it my best shot, but I want to just state, for the record, that anytime we talk about spending money, it really comes down to, like, Paul Ryan and Alan Greenspan got into it one day, in front of the camera, under oath. Paul Ryan leaned into Alan Greenspan and asked him, shouldn't we privatize Social Security? Wouldn't that make it more solvent? And Greenspan, in a moment of clarity, said, there's nothing about Social Security that's not solvent. There's nothing that prevents the United States government from ever just making all those payments. The question is, can we create an economy where the real resources are available? And that's the same question you have to ask yourself with reparations.
And Paul Ryan didn't know what that meant. Paul Ryan seemed bewildered by that answer.
He was absolutely doe-eyed. It was priceless. And no offense, but he's an Austrian too. So it was one of those moments where the idea of understanding this light bulb moment that we all have to make progress, right? And that's really the key, Jamal and gang. I really want you all to understand, change happens from the bottom up, and that's what's happening in the streets, and that's what's going to happen with economics. If we stop equivocating on this subject and start demanding we talk, not just the politicians, but our activists. I mean, we got folks in California that are good progressives, but they won't even talk about modern monetary theory. They will not even consider it. Why? It's a fiefdom thing. It's their turf. They don't want to talk about MMT because they've got other things they want to talk about. But yet they can't answer the question how they're going to pay for it. So I look at these groups, these little sectarian progressive groups running around, that if we got our head together and understood this, change happens from the bottom up. It is in our hands. We could make these changes. We could lock arms with Black Lives Matter and other groups and push for these types of changes to happen right now. But it is going to require us as a movement, as people, as regular Jane and Joe, people that are not necessarily progressives, everyone, to understand this, to change the narratives and the fights that we have politically, the volleyball games between Austrians and others. We need to recognize that we can do great things. We didn't ask these questions back in the day. We just knew the government could afford it. They've changed that around in the Milton Friedman era. The great neoliberal rise destroyed our nation. And quite frankly, it's the bane of my existence. It's the target of all my activism, is to disrupt that and to change that and to bring about a real understanding so that we can bring about reparations and many other things. But reparations is a very key component to healing this nation.
Steve, thank you for joining us. We only have about 30 seconds, maybe a minute left. We've got to go out after that. But just a real quick thought here. Bunch more I want to have in terms of this conversation. Hopefully we can get you back on soon, but very quickly. We've had a few, like I was saying earlier, we've had a few Austrian economists on, at least prominence of Austrian economics on the show. And as far as I can tell, and most of them, at least one of them that I'm thinking of, but I think most of them have been pretty critical of neoliberalism as such. So I guess part of what's confusing to me about what you're saying and what I'd like you to clarify again, just briefly, because we've got to go out. What do you see? Why do you think that is? Why do you think that there are Austrian economists? Because you were just sort of identifying them. You were saying that Austrian economics led to neoliberalism. But again, I hear a lot of Austrian economists, a lot of adherents of that, pushing back against neoliberalism. Can you help me make sense of this briefly before we go out?
Yeah, it's the concept of privatization. It's the concept of personal private property. And personal private property rights are what's driving the police behavior. It's what's driving the need for banks to give us money versus the government spending that money. The lack of understanding of where money comes from and how it comes to be and what its purpose is drives so much of these conversations and creates the false scarcity narrative that you see so often in neoclassical and Austrian economics. The free market is another key aspect of this. The idea of laissez-faire and government get out of here. Well, the problem is that government is the one that spends the money into the economy. So if government stops spending the money in the economy, as many Austrians say, then the only thing you're left with is bank money. So it's not just that they don't understand, it's that they really don't understand, and that it ends up creating situations that harm a lot of people. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Steve. Again, that was great. Very concise. Good explanation. We've got to close it there. Really appreciate you joining us. For everybody who's been listening, you've been listening to not just Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Those are the two of us hosts. You've also been listening to the voice of Steve Grumbine, who is a political, economic, and social justice activist. He's also the founder of Real Progressives and Real Progressives in Action, 501c3 and a 501c4, respectively. He's dedicated, as you just heard, to the education and advocacy for modern monetary theory. You can follow Steve on Twitter at SDGrumbine, Grumbine. Another great show coming up tomorrow. You have been listening to Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you tomorrow.
Another great show, guys. Thank you all for joining us. Steve used to be on my show all the time, so Steve's a really good friend of the show. So we have comments. Pop Reality. That guy's wrong in putting too much responsibility on unsuspecting and propagandized public. I agree with you. Then the problem with Bernie, he wasn't a true leader for democratic socialism. We need leadership. I agree with you. I mean, basically, you have a propagandized public that is voting for Joe Biden, the guy who was working in the crime bill, the guy who basically was running arm in arm with segregationists. And yeah, like I said, putting black bodies in cages, working with those segregationists. Not to mention lying about civil rights. Now, the press treats Joe Biden as if he's the most normal thing in the world for the black community. King of blacks, Joe Biden, with the King of Black whisperer, Clyburn. Well, the reality of it is the program that Sanders was putting through was infinitely better for those people at the bottom of the income distribution scale, as opposed to Joe Biden, who basically said, kick rocks with Medicare for all. And yeah, nothing is going to fundamentally change. The media, however, wasn't reporting it in those terms. The media reported it as if Joe Biden was clearly the default candidate. And Sanders had to work overtime to even get his point across on that. The catch of it is you're absolutely right. You have people who are propagandized to that you're expecting to basically come around with the right answer, despite the fact that the wrong answer is the one that they're beat over the head with. Well, there has to be some kind of reconciliation with that process. This gets to the whole blue no matter who stuff, and how the public or the press accepts the premise of blue no matter who and frames the argument in terms of a public of why aren't you voting for this person or that person? Don't you know that Donald Trump is the walking apocalypse? Never asking the question of Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden of, hey, if the overwhelming majority of the population agrees with this policy, almost unanimous support in the Democratic Party, and you are Democrats, how do you justify not supporting a policy if that would unify the party and beat a man who you are calling the walking apocalypse, the man that is going to destroy democracy itself, the bringer of rain? If that is true, then you have no justification. Why are you so politically rigid that you wouldn't support a policy that the overwhelming majority of the public, in order to concise or consolidate the support? The reality of it is they don't believe they have to. They know that 70% of the people who are voting for Joe Biden are doing so entirely to keep Trump out of office. That does not breed this need for engaging for votes. They don't think they have to. In their heads, you have nowhere else to go. And you're going to vote for Joe Biden with all of his flaws and everything else just because of who he is not because of an affirmative case of who he is. Look, I think that's real. And I think you're absolutely 100% right. Joe Signer, love the show, fellas. Thanks again for having Steve Grumbine on, spreading the MMT seeds and cleaning and crucial learning. Maximum knowledge. So yeah, Steve Grumbine is a really good guest for the show. I've always liked him coming on to the show. He gives a really good explanation of MMT. So does Stephanie Kelton. And it's to some degree accessible in regards to how he explains it. Whether I agree with all of it, or even for that matter, the politics of using the terminology as opposed to trying to just explain it before you use the terminology for it. Sometimes terminology is provocative when it definitely overturns what the public typically knows. And trying to engage in that and to unscrew what the public typically knows runs afoul of sometimes just the heading. The public may accept an explanation of what something is over the heading of what something is because the heading may have certain connotations associated with it. Steve tends to be really good at explaining his points. And you can pry into him. They try to pull out what you're trying to get out of him in regards to his explanations of MMT, because some people may not necessarily understand it in the language that he's using, but the moment that you get into the details of explaining it, it makes all the sense in the world. One of the things that's interesting is that, like, the $3 trillion dime or the $3 trillion coin that the president can have minted, sit it in the bank, and just have public draw from it as it's needed. There's so many things that we can do with finances. None of it is real. All of it is arbitrary. All of it is this kind of intellectual thing that we're saying that this tulip is worth whatever, or this figment of our imagination piece of paper is worth whatever. All of those things are conceptions of mind. Those things are not necessarily conceptions of reality. And any infusion of value into a particular asset, especially when we're talking about a juxtaposition of assets of this in comparison to this, is always going to be somewhat flawed and always going to be somewhat arbitrary, not real. Your resources for your society are real. The ability to use those resources and to build the things that your society needs for health and happiness of the human animal, those things are real and important. Cash in and of itself, and the deification of that cash, and the worshiping of that cash, those things are figments of our imagination. We give those things value. We ascribe the product of work into this intangible, esoteric quantity of cash. And we go about our way. If you don't have that paper, you can't get a house. If you don't have that paper, you may not be able to stay warm for the winter. If you can't have that paper, you may not get the medical attention that you need, or for that matter, the college education that you need. All of these things are things that would expand human potential, and yet the barrier is cash. Our society needs to change fundamentally if we want to get rid of the crime, if we want to allow people to get their education that they want to the degree that they want their education. Like, these are things that we can do even in the context of a capitalistic society that we choose not to do because we're that rapacious in ensuring that the wealth goes to the top. That needs to change. I want to end this here. Like, share, and subscribe. Yes, scarcity is a choice. Only good for some, but it's a choice nonetheless.